if board members have updates they'd like to share, just general updates pertinent to the work of the group, but things that aren't on the agenda, we'll make sure to save a little time here for that as well. Shannon, would you be willing to start with an update on FMP development, just broadly?
Sure, happy to. So work on the draft FMP has been continuing alongside all of the other areas of Elliott planning, including the ones that we're going to discuss more in depth today based on the agenda. But the team is incorporating edits for existing sections as well as drafting new chapters. And that includes work with our technical writer as well as 2 forestry consultants who are working on the project and others who have been involved throughout the development of the FMP. So new section development has focused on a disturbance and forest health chapter, as well as drafting some text in the governance chapter related to operations of the forest, the information that's in Senate Bill 1546, and details that DSL and OSU are working on with all of you. So we'll be working with this board and subcommittees of this prospective board and others on continued development of that information going into the FMP and sharing updated draft sections with you, particularly the new sections that weren't part of the November working draft as one of those priority sections. We're working on getting those out to you sooner so that you can review that new information alongside updates that are being made to the other sections.
Thanks, Shannon. And I think at the highest level, I think what we wanted to communicate is there are very detailed components of the HCP FMP space that we're going to focus on today and have been talking more about, but the team is continuing to drive forward on the entirety of the FMP concurrent to that. So important that you all know that. Brett, are you in a position that you can speak to the appropriations updates?
Let me get off mute. Oh, I'm sorry. Is my video, can you all see me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Interesting. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on. Let me do this really quick, and then I may have to jump off and jump back on because it says my video is on. Okay. So yeah, on appropriations, I think developments in this in some ways relates to an update Vicky's going to touch on related to Shutter Creek. But since we all last met, DSL has received finally a point of contact from the federal government through HUD related to fiscal year 2023 appropriations ask that DSL had put forward tied to Shutter Creek, and that's a $4 million community development block grant award that would be coming from HUD to DSL for the purposes of the transformation of Shutter Creek into a research facility tied to the Elliott State Research Forest Authority. And there's a lot of work that's relevant to that. So that's an update related to past appropriations asks and good news finally flowing from that. I'll say, I think Vicky's got more to expand on that, but related to the upcoming fiscal year, fiscal year 24, Senator Merkley's office, who's chair of the Interior Appropriations Committee, he has had his deadlines come and go last Friday around wanting to collect and collect information from all of those of his constituents who are looking to make asks into fiscal year 24 appropriations. And DSL put forward 3. One relates to additional money to try to round out more funding for what the realistic costs are going to be tied to Shutter Creek and that facility's redevelopment. Another one is to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in one of its accounts, tied to the specifically, it's tied to barred owl / northern spotted owl research, as well as and management of barred owls, as well as murrelet detection research and efforts. And there are some equipment tied to it. And then there's some additional funding asks related to helping to address, these are all kind of relevant to the HCP and recovery and conservation commitments around spotted owl and murrelet. There are some HCP monitoring and effectiveness monitoring costs that are also built into that ask. It's a $3 million ask with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Then there's a final one to U.S. Forest Service, state and private forestry, that would be to round out funding needed for the development of recreation and education plans tied to the Elliott. This has been a commitment all along, and it's parked in the current draft FMP as, assuming everything moves forward. This is where we still need to go around discrete plans tied to recreation and education. And so we've asked for some state and private funding from U.S. Forest Service to do that. For sake of brevity, we've been coordinating all of this with the governor's office. She's supportive, and with OSU, and OSU has an additional ask into state and private forestry, which we've been coordinating on. And that relates to equipment related funding and detection research related to the carbon front. And I don't know, Shannon, if there's anything more to say about it, but I think the upshot is there's a host of asks and related to the larger effort of, let's try to address what has been ballparked under the startup costs for the forest, and costs that I think are relevant to doing what everybody on the Prospective board who's been involved in this over time wants to see move forward on the Elliott. And the stuff that's going to take money needs connections to money. The ongoing state legislative session is the last thing I'd mention, Peter, on TBD, but potential conversations there related to capital construction bonding in Shutter Creek. But there are a host of issues that I think we still need to work through on that front. And I can't say anything more than that, other than we're looking across the state and federal field.
Thanks, Brett. Any questions for Brett? And Shannon, anything you wanted to add related to the OSU ask?
No, I think Brett covered it on the ask for climate smart and carbon related equipment. And then, like he said, we worked together on description for a funding request related to marbled murrelet and northern spotted owl.
Great. Any questions from the board?
Neil, I'm sorry about not being visible. I'm not sure it would help the meeting any, but I'm going to try to get visible.
Great. Thanks, Brett.
Peter, I guess the one other thing to mention, because Brett did mention the 4 million for Shutter Creek that came through fiscal year 23 congressional funding requests. And so alongside of that, there's an additional 3.5 million that OSU has received that's coming through the Forest Service. And that's for monitoring equipment related to the research program.
Great. Thanks, Shannon.
The 4 million that's in place, is it dedicated to, what's it dedicated to? Specifically.
On Shutter Creek?
Yeah.
So generally speaking, it's dedicated to things like continuing to pay for the ongoing costs of security and maintenance on the site. And these are costs that Department of Corrections has been shouldering. And as DSL moves into deed language change with GSA, which Vicky can speak to, we're going to be inheriting costs. And so covering that, but broader than that, Paul, it's the we need it's to cover costs related to coming up with a development, or I should say redevelopment plan related to the site, and depending on how much that costs, having some money still available to move forward with some actual work on the ground. The term for spending this money, our initial understanding is it's a pretty good runway. It's not like we have to have it all committed and spent by the end of September 2023. So I think what it can allow is for further conversations to advance with OSU, with the Prospective Board, with the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Laurentian, and Siuslaw around, and then county partners too, around the vision for the site, putting it into a meaningful set of plans that can then tie into the ability for contracts and RFPs to go out, and then potentially actually doing some work to remove some buildings, upgrade other buildings. There's some maintenance needs that I think we're aware of, so that kind of thing. But it won't, 4 million won't satisfy everything. I think the overall budget to do what's contemplated, at least roughly, knowing that we've got a lot more visioning and planning to do, is, upwards of getting closer to 20 million. So
Well,
this
it
is
would
seed
be
money.
good to see that budget and know what somebody is planning. I mean, because we
I
had one
can
field
speak to
trip.
this, Paul. I can
What?
speak to this, Paul, in a minute.
What's
Okay.
that?
I think the quick answer, Paul, is we just got the money and just got a HUD contact, and this is what we need to prepare is, proposed budget and the narrative on how things would be spent. And so this is real-time update and something to
Okay,
do.
but
Yeah.
what I'm saying is if there's a $20 million estimate of what we need to do, then somebody has obviously put pencil to paper and come up with a rough idea of what they want to do out there.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to that, Paul. Just give me a minute and I'll answer your question.
Okay,
Why don't we actually go ahead, Vicky, and transition directly to that topic, unless there's another board member who has a question related to a different appropriation. All right, go ahead, Vicky.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So as Brett laid out, we have the 4 million. Unfortunately, it's a little bit complicated because it was designated to DAS. I spoke with DAS this morning, Robert Underwood, who used to work for us and now is at DAS. And I said, Robert, you owe me. You left my agency and you went to DAS. And so now I need you to step in and help the Elliott. So he is on it. He'll be getting in touch with you, Brett. But one of the things we need to do, there's a couple things, Paul. One, we have to untangle how DAS got on the 4 million and get that transferred back over to DSL so that we can manage it. The second thing is the DSL has to get a development plan in place for the property. So I asked Robert this morning if DAS has people in their employee to assist agencies in helping do that. He believed they do, but I've tasked Brett with going back to the Department of Corrections and finding out who did the survey in 2017 that detailed the 26 buildings and what condition they're in and what needs to be done, and ask if that contractor is still in business. And if so, can that contractor give us an update on those 26 buildings? Because we have to have a development plan. We have to know how much money it's going to cost to do what. We have to know which buildings we're going to raise and which ones we aren't. That isn't a decision that's made in a vacuum. Let me tell you that I had a government to government consultation with the CT Klutsi tribe. They're very much interested in continuing their collaboration with us on the site. So much so that when I accepted the letter that was sent to me in November from GSA, whether I'm going to accept the site, the CT Klutsi and I wrote a joint letter from their tribal chair indicating the continued partnership and what we're interested in doing. So let me back up. The letter of November 17, 2022 It said that they had received our application for real property. It's called an application for real property for the conservation of wildlife. And it was regarding the Shutter Creek Correctional Institution. We wrote this application, and I was looking at it as Brett was speaking, and I see C2 Klutzy was spelled wrong in one location, so they obviously did not have me proofread. But the purpose of the property is that none of the property would be set aside as a wildlife refuge, but the entirety of the property will be used to support species monitoring, recovery, and research activities associated with the Elliott State Research Forest and the associated habitat conservation plan covering these protected species. In addition, the property would support a contemplated partnership with the CT Klutzy by affording facilities to support management of tribal forest lands and joint research undertakings on the Elliott between Oregon State University and the CT Klutzy focused on traditional and contemporary forest management practices. And it goes on to talk about the 49 acres, the 26 buildings, and that we need to honor the historic connection of the land to the CT Klutzy tribe. So the first step is that we need to get an update on these buildings. One of the ways to control management costs of this site is we're going to have to raise these buildings. Not all of them, but many of them. We don't need them. The purpose of a wildlife application, the wildlife conservation of wildlife, isn't to preserve all those buildings. It's to restore the site with a native plant species and other things, as well as using it for the things that I've outlined here. So we need to figure out which ones are in very bad shape and which ones are not. The tribal chair and the tribal council need to go visit the site and review those buildings in the context of that report. And they will have conversations with the department as to what, if any, of those buildings they would like to keep. I already know which buildings that Oregon State University is interested in, so we've got that taken care of. Then we can start with our development plan. Then we can discuss where that $4 million is going to be applied in terms of development of the site and how much that development's going to cost. I can tell you, I am not interested in continuing to pay outrageous sums of money to support the maintenance and protection of that property without reducing those costs. And the only way to reduce those costs is to reduce the dilapidated buildings on that site. So I'm very much interested in doing that because the report that we got from Department of Corrections, if I'm not mistaken, Brett, it was anywhere from $28,000 to $50,000 a month. And it depended on what was happening on the site. That's a lot of money. I'm not interested in spending that. So we have, according to the letter of November 17, 2022, we have the right to accept the change of the public benefit use of the property or withdraw our application no later than August 1 of 2023. So we have until August to make a decision about Shutter Creek. So that's why we have to continue to work with all due dispatch, because I have to make a decision by August 1. Yet in the meantime, I am paying for those costs. And when I make that final decision on August 1, the department is still on the hook for the next 12 months for the protection and maintenance of the site until GSA can sell it to someone else. So there's a lot on the line here. I took a giant leap after much consultation and looking like this project is going forward. And that's where we're at today. Paul, did I answer your question?
Kind of. I would be interested in knowing which buildings OSU wants.
They want the buildings down below that are the newest buildings, the ones where the inmates were housed.
Okay.
And I can give you the buildings are numbered on a chart, but they want
Yeah,
those.
I know which ones those are. That's good.
Yeah, and I think there was one more building.
Paul,
Yeah,
do you want to briefly speak to that? And then I'm going to transition us to the next agenda topic because we've
Yeah.
got a lot to
Yeah.
cover. Go ahead,
And
Paul.
Peter,
Uh,
Peter, let me add one thing to that before you go too. Just one question for Vicky. It'll take 10 seconds.
Okay. Paul Odenthal, then Keith.
Yeah, real quick. Yeah, so Paul, it's the newer building down below the barracks, the housing unit, and one of the ones next to it, which is older as well, for some office space and berthing as well on the requirements there. But we're also, as Klutzy comes in, we want to have discussions with them about the hilltop. I think we have shared interest in some of the spaces where we can work together and not just duplicate effort up on the hill, but share it and come up with a plan for Shutter Creek that supports all of us up there that need to be on the site. And we have included, within our plans, we've included some administrative space for the authority to have within those buildings as well, not just OSU.
Thanks. Keith?
Yeah, Vicky, when you get the contractor or locate that contractor, make sure they discuss the electrical upgrades that are needed there too, please. Yeah, I know that, I'm on the board at Central Lincoln and we served, we delivered electrons up there. And we had an agreement with them that our folks would not go on property and do electrical work because it was badly in need of upgrade.
Yeah, well, that'll be the conversation, is what kind of sewer and electrical and other water upgrades are needed.
Okay.
And I know that the communities that supply that are not going to be happy that we take down some buildings and no longer need those services, but it's got to be done. So, okay, that's my update with regard to Shutter Creek. Did anybody else have any other questions?
Yes, thanks, Keith. Brett, one more thing on this.
Yeah, I think what might help, just so you all know, getting out to the site. I mean, I think Paul, I know there's interest there, and then Keith and Paul Odenthal as well. And there's interest from, Colin, I know on the tribes end. I'm looking at trying to pull together a site visit. I'll be back for the April 17th, 18th retreat. And sometime, that after that, during that week, we could potentially do something. But I think, Vicky, I know you want to get up there as soon as possible with members of the tribal council. But I think to play this out, because this is an update item, getting up there together, and for all prospective board members who might be interested, please just let me know. And it's probably a helpful thing to all be looking at it with the same eyes together, along with other potential partners.
Thanks, Brett. All right, transitioning to the next agenda topic. We'll pull up, I think Jenna's ready to pull up the operating principles. As she does that, I just want to flag for members of the public, we have a time reserved for public comment towards the end of the meeting, approximately 3:40 or thereabouts. If you're interested in providing public comment, if you send a chat via the Zoom link or via Zoom to either Jenna or I, we'll make sure to get you in the queue and plan our sort of available time based on how many people are interested. I promise not to make you go through an extensive wordsmithing exercise and editing as a group exercise, but it does feel important to walk through very briefly and a high level on the operating principles. If you had a chance, and I'll say this at the outset, for this as one example, but our hope is that when we're sending materials, we're going to try to get them at least a week in advance to you, in hopes that you have time to review them, and we could focus our conversations during these meetings on you all talking with each other. So again, I'm going to go through a high level overview. If you have feedback or specific questions, we could take those now and we'll try to craft a revised version based on input subsequent to the meeting and back and forth with you over email and confirm this at your next meeting. So much of this is based on two things. Vicky, do you want to get in now or do you?
No, I need to get in now, please. Because we consulted with our DOJ counsel and I think we need to be clear. First of all, you all are not a board yet. And the operating protocols mixed up board with prospective board. So that needs to be cleaned up and will be cleaned up. There's also decisions that you can't make a decision as a board yet because you're not a board. But I think as Peter will talk about, you're doing work by consensus in terms of preparing information and advice. But I just wanted to be clear that we're going to have to clean up a lot of these things in the protocols to make it clear what your responsibilities are as a prospective board, as related to I hate to say real board, but as a authorized board, let me put it that way, because you won't really be a board until January 1.
Great, thanks. That covered some of what I was going to cover. Paul?
Oh, thank you.
So this document is something that the DSL created?
Yeah, so the two things, actually, Jenna and I just put it together as a very early draft, and it was pulled together based on two documents. It was a lot of for the how you're going to operate components. That is really based on how the advisory committee operated and the commitments, to good faith and things of that nature were based on the advisory committee operating principles. And then when we talked about the tasks of the board, those were pulled directly from the legislation that established your legislation on the authority. So those are the two pieces that we pulled, sort of cobbled together, and it's really pretty scratched out. So again, looking for feedback and doing so with an eye towards exactly what Vicky said. You're in a unique space because you are a prospective board, not yet a board, and you'll need, once you're a board, bylaws that more formally describe these things.
So let me interrupt here. One of the things our DOJ counsel suggested is that we develop protocols for the next 9 months of operating. And then you develop another set of protocols that you'll look at and adopt when you become an official board. That's better than real, so official. So really it's about the next 9 months of operation that I'm very concerned about, making sure you understand how that we're going to operate. And then it would be completely different. You'll probably draw from these elements as you develop your operating protocols and operating bylaws for when you are an official board. But for now, I really want you, as you think about this, let's focus on what we're going to do over the next 9 months.
Good, helpful.
Peter, I think what Vicky's trying to get at, and there are some edits that we can put into this that I think can keep the operating principles document as something that's relevant and workable for the next 9 months, and then potentially has a life after 9 months when the authority becomes vested under law and when the prospective board becomes an actual board. These could be converted and cleaned up a little more then, but I can get some language back. And I think, this could be fully tied off probably in April, but I think what Vicky's getting at is just our initial understanding was, okay, the desire for this coming out of the last meeting was, let's have some operating principles that are relevant to what we do. and how this prospective board functions. And I think what we heard back from DOJ counsel was, okay, but we've got to make it clear that right now the prospective board doesn't have the authority to make decisions under law and doesn't have the authority to really do anything more than make recommendations to DSL. So that's the kind of thing where it's just right sizing things under what's legal and what goes into a formal document like this, and meshing it with what's desired from how are we going to work, code of conduct, good faith, that kind of thing.
Great. Mike?
Yeah, I understand what everybody's talking about here. I would hope as an agenda item, I guess, for us as a prospective board, as we get towards the end of the year, that we spend some time coming up with our operating protocols for the official board, so that when the official board gets online, one of the first things we can do is approve those, so that we're not just fumbling around for a couple meetings trying to come up with what do we want our protocols to be, so that we have that pretty well worked out, albeit not officially approved, but pretty well worked out by the time that we become an official board.
Thanks, Mike. Let me go to Melissa and then Jennifer.
Thanks, Peter. I suppose I would question whether creating and editing this document is really the best use of the board's time at this time, given the fact that we're interim. There is a ton of work to do between now and when this board becomes permanent. And really, I think it would be good to just, when we do the retreat, set the board down, make a list of things that we agree on and how we're going to behave, such as, we won't interrupt each other, we'll raise our hand, we'll take turns. We understand that we only have the ability to advise DSL, and just leave it at that. Basically, a one-pager as opposed to a more formalized document. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Jennifer?
What she said. No, actually, along the same lines of, I think the opportunity we have, which is a little unusual, is to have some time to figure out how to work well together, and also how to move toward a collective ability to work as a collective, recognizing we each bring our own perspectives. And that's one reason each of us is here. But then we have this time to figure out, along the lines of what Melissa said, how do we do this in a way where we're bringing our perspectives together, and then also being able to think like a board, as opposed to a stakeholder group or something where individually we're here for our own reasons.
Great. And I see a thumbs up from Paul Beck. I see other people's heads nodding, and simpler is better at this point. So anybody else want to talk more about the operating principles right now? Otherwise, I'm going to buy the time for the rest of the agenda. Thanks, Bob. Bob as well. Good. All right, onward. I think we've got, I can't remember if, as we transition to the budget, if Brett or Shannon, I think Shannon, you were going to go first on this section. Is that right?
I think so, yeah.
All right.
And Jenna, were you going to pull up the budgets, or is that something that Brett and I should do?
Happy to pull that up.
Okay. So while Jenna does that, as I think was noted at the beginning of the meeting and in the email from last week, these right now are two separate drafts for budgets. There's this budget, which for anyone who was on the advisory committee, the structure of this is going to look very familiar. This has been updated, but it really follows the structure that we've been working with for the Elliott State Research Forest operations for research and management. And then there is another component of the budget that right now is in a separate document that relates to the authority's budget as an agency. And so DSL and OSU have been working together on these and communicating on them. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure to take time for today was a discussion with you all about these budgets and how we see them coming together. So with that, we wanted to save the majority of the time for discussion. and just give a high-level overview of each of these documents that you have in front of you, and we're happy to answer any questions that might come up. But this is the draft budget as of February 2023 for the Elliott State Research Forest operations and management. And so the first section that you'll see at the top, well, the first two sections are dedicated to personnel. There's a section on operations personnel, and you can see the description there, as well as a cost that includes salary and OPE. Thanks for making that bigger, Jenna. And this includes positions such as the foresters, forest engineer, GIS inventory, executive assistant. Then there is a second group of personnel that are categorized as research personnel. These categories are a little bit artificial because of the nature of the Elliott as a research forest. There is quite a bit of overlap in the reality of how the research program is envisioned as being implemented and how these individuals will work together. But you'll see on this research personnel side, there is an executive director, communications. There are professorial research faculty. These are tenure track positions. That's what the TT means, as well as multiple positions for research technicians that are faculty research assistant categories. And then several lines here for graduate research assistants and student interns who would be part of the Elliott. So that's the personnel. Again, these have been updated with 2023 costs, and that's including salary, OPE benefits, and fringe. And you'll note the areas, the executive assistant, the executive director, and the communications specialist that we flagged in particular for further discussion with the board. And you'll see similar positions highlighted on the other budget. So that's one of the things that we want to make sure to talk with you about today, is how all of these things come together. The next section is operating expenses for research and management. Oh, I see Paul's hand.
Yeah, I see you did at least put needs further discussion on the executive director. I feel pretty strongly that needs to be an authority employee.
Yes. So let me just clarify. The executive director being on this spreadsheet does not mean that this is an OSU employee. So the executive director, as it's outlined in the legislation, is an authority employee, and that is not an adjustment that any of us are trying to make.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the clarification. And just as we walk through this, Shannon said it, we're giving, she is giving, and Brett will do the same on the agency version of the budgets, but really high level with an intent that, not to ask you to dig into sort of the numbers or the, sort of how many of each specific position at this point in time, but rather to give you a sense of the categories of effort that are anticipated, and ask you the question of, are there things you anticipate this authority needing or the research side needing that aren't contemplated in this budget, as well as to discuss the roles and responsibilities specifically for the ED and communications person. So we want to give you the high level overview of both budgets, identify those areas where there's overlap, and then have the discussion of, do we have the duties captured in these budgets? How do you think about the roles and responsibilities in those two specific categories in particular? And then the team can work to reconcile the two budgets and bring them together into a single. So with that, and sorry for the interruption there, Shannon, but
No.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Peter, for that clarification. And this is something in particular that we want to talk about related to the executive director and the communications specialist. The executive director will have responsibilities related to the public agency as well as the research forest. And so that's one of the things that we want to talk about today, because either in that role and or captured in other roles, it's important to have a research director component to that. So that's one of the things that we wanted to talk with you all about. So operating expenses for research and management, you'll see services and supplies, rent or leasing space that begins in the budget as a rental, but then as permanent facilities are renovated or constructed, that would cost would carry over as lease space. There is an equipment and vehicle reserve fund that has funds built in for replacement of vehicles and equipment with 8 vehicles for the forest. There's vehicle maintenance and fuel with updated 2023 rates. There's a line for recreational expenses. This is something that has also been adjusted since the last budget slightly, but you'll note here that this really needs to be revised further, including through the Elliott State Research Forest Recreation Plan, which is an additional plan that the legislation outlines as needing to be developed. And so depending on what that plan says, that may impact this number as well. But this is the current estimate that we have. There's ODF wildfire protection, and this is an updated as of January 2023. There's a line item here on HCP monitoring, and these are for monitoring expenses that are outside the scope of the research program monitoring and other personnel and operational costs that are captured in other areas of this budget. So quite a bit of the monitoring and the personnel for the research program contribute to the commitments in the HCP. This line is meant to capture additional expenses beyond that for compliance, monitoring, and other areas specifically related to the HCP. You'll see another note here that this is to be updated based on HCP draft revisions, which are in progress. So DSL, ICF, and OSU are working together on these numbers as edits are made to the HCP. There's a road operations and maintenance, and there's a budget here as well as additional expenses for roads related specifically to harvest that are captured in the net revenue. So there with revenue and financial analysis calculations, which we're working on a range of values for, that net revenue includes silvicultural logging and hauling costs, as well as some costs related to roads that are outside of this operations and maintenance budget. So those are captured in 2 different places. There's a line for sheriff patrol agreements with Coos and Douglas counties, and this is current as of right now for what DSL is paying, as well as a line for assessments, OSU overhead for administrative services. You'll see this is 3% of total expenses, not including the contingency fund. And this is current as of right now for OSU policy. There is a contingency fund line, which is a reserve fund that is meant to build year upon year to help buffer against unforeseen expenses, capital expenses that may not be part of annual operating estimates, as well as market fluctuations or revenue downturns. And then the final category here is research expenses, and you'll see a line for research monitoring and equipment replacement. This is based on a percentage of the total amount and scope of monitoring equipment that's envisioned for the forest and is tied to the startup funds. There is a line for IT data storage software, QA/QC, and this is based on conversations with the university as well as the H.J. Andrews, which we're using as a model. There's a research equipment maintenance fund, and then finally a staff development and travel for trainings and meetings line. So again, this is a draft with updated numbers based on the current information that we have available, and is something that we're continuing to work on together. And Jack, I see your hand.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. I was just wondering on the roads O&M, is that something that's likely to be, do you anticipate that being contracted out to local local folks, or is that something that OSU would actually conduct?
So that's an area where we'd be working with contractors. There aren't on the personnel list specific people other than a forest engineer, and of course the lead forester and the forester who are responsible for operations. But the actual quite a bit of the road work we anticipate would be contracted out, similarly to what is happening right now with the forest.
That was my assumption, but I just wanted to make sure I was following.
Thanks, Jack.
Shannon, can I ask two questions? One is explain the recreational expenses.
So the recreational expenses is based on current estimates for the level of recreation that's happening on the forest now. So that is public access, use of the roads, hunting, fishing, wildlife watching. So it's that level of recreation, and it would include things like signage. It does not include any expenses, for example, if the recreation plan were to expand or formalize the type of recreation that would happen, and then the resources that would be needed to carry out that vision would need to be reassessed. But for right now, the vision is to maintain the current level of recreation and public access on the forest.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure where the dollars were going, but it's signage and things along those lines make sense. And then one last question, and maybe this is for whoever can throw in here. Just in my background in via the city and public agencies and the contingency fund of what do you got, about 10% there? Is that about right? $5 million. So we got 500,000. So yeah, I guess I was worried that was under, but that's probably is a little less than I normally see in contingency fund for bidding. And but not a lot less, I suppose. 15% seems to be about right. I would caution that we don't underestimate there.
Thanks, Keith. Colin?
Yeah, just a quick comment. It'd be nice to see, and you might have this already, but it would be nice to see more of a breakdown on some of the assumptions that went into some of these line items. We have some pretty big numbers on single lines here. It'd be nice to see a little bit more of a breakdown. For example, vehicles, what sort of vehicles are you going to be leasing or buying? How many trips to the woods, how many miles per trip, that sort of thing. Surveys and inventory, what sort of surveys, what sort of inventory work are you going to be doing? How many acres per year? What sort of cost per plot or per acre? Salaries, it'd be nice to see more of a breakdown, base salary versus fringe and benefits. It'd be nice to see on, things like training. What does that training and travel cost look like per employee? How much travel, how many trips are you assuming per employee? How many overnight stays? How many miles of travel? What sort of training, seminar costs, those sorts of things. So yeah, if you could share some of that with the group, that'd be helpful.
Absolutely. Yes. We have that level of detail that went into building the spreadsheet, so we can share a more detailed version that gets at some of those costs.
Okay.
I'm probably jumping way ahead, but this looks very much like the budget that we saw quite a while back, bottom line number anyway. And the money isn't going to be there to do this. It just flat isn't going to be there to sustain this budget. So I'm wondering if it wouldn't be a good exercise to go through and prioritize, 1, 2, 3, 4, how high it is to have that particular budget item, or what could be trimmed from that budget item. because frankly, this budget isn't going to work.
So this gets into, I appreciate you flagging it and raising the issue, Paul. Obviously that's beyond sort of, as you said, jumping a little bit forward. I think if we can, let's put a pin in it. I don't mean to diminish the significance of what you're raising. Let's let Shannon complete this, go through the Brett's version of their side, and then get into the sort of roles and responsibilities, knowing that that financial viability stuff also is on the agenda for, as it relates to HCP, the buffering stuff, and that all translates back into some of this as well. So we'll make
I'd like to say something too, Peter, if I could, just really briefly.
Yeah.
I appreciate Paul's comment. I think that, you know, first of all, we want to give you all the detail here. Here's what it would take to create a world-class research forest as per the mission of the forest itself. And we can then prioritize what needs to be removed. We have the management requirements that are, you know, land managers, forest managers, and then we have the research personnel and expenditures, and prioritizing what needs to be taken out. Should we downgrade the budget based on updated revenue projections? That's the next step. But this right here is laying out, this is what the world-class research forest would look like based on that more idealized revenue projection around 5.6 million. And Jen, if you wanted to add anything to that, go ahead. Or Paul.
Paul or
Yeah,
Jay?
I just wanted to put a pin in it, as Peter said, a great big red one. Because it's something we're going to have to talk about. So
Yeah, totally.
Let's get ready.
Thanks, Paul. Paul Odenthal or anybody else on the OSU team want to chime in here?
I think Tom said it well, and Paul, you're not wrong. I mean, this is something that we want it to be scalable, and we'll work with this as we look at the revenue side and we put this all together.
I also want to say there's additional sources of income too. This is just the timber revenue that we're looking at. Grants and contracts, gifts, endowments. Universities have operated very well for many, many centuries on raising more money than they have on just some sources of income. So I want to keep that in mind too, Paul. I agree that timber revenues might not do it, but it doesn't mean that this isn't our target. So.
All right. More to come, as Paul said on that conversation. Good. Jenny, you want to pull the spreadsheet back up, and Shannon will let you finish and then transition to Brett.
I think that was it for me.
Oh yeah, great. We were good. All right, we can pull up Brett's.
Yeah, I'm learning that with this prospective board, it's never good to ask the question, okay, are we sure we're good? When we're trying to move forward with another part of the presentation. We do have, just so you all know where this is going, Shannon and I put together a couple question prompts, but you all probably don't need it. I think part of the challenge here is, and the reason you're seeing two budgets is what's being created in this new authority, and the board attached to it is a bit of a platypus, even though it's not a duck, it's a beaver. It's a weird animal in the sense that this is it's a research forest with an authority that needs to be budgeted for research and operations, and it's a new state executive branch agency. And it's trying to do, I mean, the premise is it will do both things. What we see here, and I'm not going to go through line by line. I think I'll speak to the categories, but just a little background on this side of the budget. This is full caveat. a draft, and this is, I think, for what both Shannon and I have done, it's a tool. And it's a tool to start the discussions that are needed around what the board really wants this authority, or the prospective board wants this authority to be, and how it should be staffed. Gene Strait, who's the budget director at DSL, did this budget, and I unpacked it a bit with Gene to be sure I'm clear on it. But I mean, where it comes from is she looked at other state boards and commissions that would be a similar size to what's being proposed here. And she looked at factors around like where do they have their staff, how do they have it staffed out, where are the DAS costs, basically tried to pull something together that would be a similar scale to what we're talking about as taken from other existing state boards and commissions, and their underlying kind of agency apparatus. The assumptions in this are stated at the bottom. I think Gene tried to be pretty careful about laying out, yeah, thanks, Jenna, what all the assumptions were here. And partly Shannon and I want to try to keep the conversation around that larger question of what this prospective board wants the authority to be, and you know, budgets can scale to that, and have the discussion there. But so we're hopeful that, you know, you've all read through these, and including the assumptions. I won't go through them line by line, but Shannon, if you can go back up, I think some of the high points to hit here, and some of the reasons. The reason there's yellow highlights on some of these rows, that flags areas of duplication that exist between the budget Shannon just showed and the one I'm showing now. And it's intentional to be able to have this conversation around, you know, there's an agency head in the state executive branch agency setting that does a lot of things, a lot of roles and responsibilities that, you know, Vicky can speak to well, but you know, that includes legislative engagement, engagement across the state executive branch enterprise, everything from managing staff to a whole lot of other work within the administrative agency realm. And then there's an agency head in the context of operating and advancing a research forest. So some of these positions are flagged twice so that we can, you know, save space for this conversation about how the platypus comes together. Some of the services, and sorry, the professional services line item, it's a big number. It's taken directly from the what is it? The June 1, 2022 Elliott State Research Forest Assessment Package, and it rolls up a lot of costs that have been spent to date, and kind of gives a flavor of Common School Fund's been paying a lot of money for professional services related to this endeavor. I don't suspect that it would, you know, for every year the authority exists and has a budget, always remain this high, but it's Gene reflected it in order to, you know, full disclosure on what's been happening to date. What else to say about the personal services category? I think other things you might expect in the, you know, yellow highlighted 15,000 for other S&S service and supply. That's office equipment, computers, things like that aren't necessarily recurring costs, but you want to budget for them. In the services and supplies below that, that is more related to, it was hard to figure out exactly what to put here. Gene didn't put a lot, because the assumption is there's going to be this conversation around how this relates on the operations and research end of the budget. I don't have a whole lot other than, you know, what this is based on is generally what it would take to run a new executive branch agency of a size that we're, I think, talking about here, tied to the authority and the costs that go into it. I think what's really needed is the board conversation around how to narrow down what you all as prospective board members want the authority to be. And then, narrowing and pegging costs can be done a little more accurately. But I think what we've wanted to put out there is whether certain yellow highlighted things get merged into, one person or one cost line, or whether this remains separate staff. This is what it would take to do not the work on the operations and research end, but the work of engaging, advancing, and executing a new state administrative agency.
Thanks, Brett. Colin, it looks like you had a comment or a question.
Yeah, so when I was looking at this originally, I was assuming that 4,300 line item professional services, that was the management contract with OSU. Is that not the case?
Colin, my understanding is that covers more. Well, does that match your line for Shannon for management fee on the operations side? My understanding, Colin, is no, that this relates to things that are more around what's been paid to date on staff that's been or staffing efforts, contracts that have been subcontracted out. And that can relate to folks who are working on the HCP, folks who are working on the LiDAR contract, for example. I can go back and verify, but that was my sense in that on the other side of the operations and research budget, that's where we had the management fee estimate pegged. Is that, Shannon, your understanding too?
I think Jean over at DSL would be the best person to answer this because she put together that spreadsheet. But my understanding when we talked with her was that that she did look at the Elliott State Research Forest budget that I just went through, and she took that bottom number and then made some adjustments for areas where she saw some duplication. So some of it might be accounted for already. But that was my takeaway from talking with her. She would be the one to ask about where that number came from.
Okay, well, let me circle back with Jean, Colin, and then chase it down for you to make sure it's clear what that number actually is.
Thanks for the question, Brett. Thanks for doing the follow-up. We'll track it as an action item. Any other questions for Brett?
I've got one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
One thing that I didn't see on either budget is any funding for tribal support and actually managing the Elliott. I think the tribes are anticipating, and I think OSU and the board are anticipating too, that the tribes will be playing an active role in actually managing the Elliott on the ground. There will be tribal people out there doing work on the forest, and I want to make sure that that's funded. And that we're not relying on the tribes to support their own work in relation to the Elliott.
That's a helpful, Jenna, I don't know if you could pull up the slides. I think this is a helpful prompt or a helpful question that ties exactly to the prompt, which was like, what's missing? Yeah, if you could go to the next one. Yeah. I mean, these were some of the questions that on this, overall, before we get into the discussion of executive director and staff, Shannon and I teed up some prompts for y'all to consider, but you may already be rolling on questions because Colin, what you just asked is spot on with like, okay, tell us what's missing.
Great, thanks. Let's just follow that thread a little bit. Didn't look like there were any additional questions for Brett. Does the board have any other sort of things you would have anticipated seeing in, I'm going to call them the budget, even though there's two of them, knowing that they're going to merge together here? things that you would have anticipated being there or think should be included in the budget that aren't there currently? All right, that's good. And then how about when you look at the scope question? I mean, are they relatively in the ballpark of what you're expecting, or are there any feedback broadly there outside of sort of the gaps question? Paul?
Yeah, could you say that again, please?
Well, I didn't really articulate. I guess what I'm looking for, and I don't think you need to respond to my specific question. I think is, do you have additional feedback or questions related to these budgets? And, in terms of the relative magnitude of them and sort of gaps, or, are there positions or categories that are missing? Or things that maybe you think don't belong, I suppose. So I'm going to follow Paul, then Colin, then Jack.
Okay.
And Jenna, if you don't mind dropping the questions off now so we can see each other, that'd be great.
I guess in general, and the first time I saw this budget, we had the discussion to look for efficiencies. You've got 5 different positions that maybe could be covered by 2 people if you hire the right person. There's a bunch of work that needs to be done that doesn't make sense maybe to have an engineer on staff to contract that out. And it just we really need to zero in on where we can find those efficiencies of hiring the right person that has the right skill set that can do multiple things, and contracting.
Thanks, Paul. Jack?
Yeah, I was just wondering if, since we've had some discussion on Shutter Creek facility, if there are things that are captured in the budget relative to that, or if so, they were a little bit hidden to me, and I was just wondering if somebody could comment on that.
Yeah, Jack, I'll take a shot. So the costs related to a one-time capital project around redevelopment of that site are not in those budgets. It's a separate budgeting exercise around a redevelopment plan that still needs work. But what those 2 budgets do attempt to recognize is the intent is for the authority headquarters to be located there at Shutter Creek, and the executive director to be housed there, and so and other staff located in kind of that part of the state. So it's part of the community and economic benefit side of what we're doing here. There's an assumption that on the lease payments that the authority we need to figure out on Shutter Creek who specifically is going to own it over time. But right now, the way it's budgeted is, well, I should say right now, the way the transact or the deed title work would happen is, like Vicky updated, it would come to DSL and still be a federal GSA public benefit use property that's managed under wildlife conservation, but that has infrastructure on it. The assumption in the budget realm is that there'd be lease payments made for the authority to have space there. And that part's built in, but the larger, what is it going to take to do all the redevelopment is not built into that, to what you saw.
That answer your question, Jack?
Yeah, I think so. It just seemed like there might be some level of recurring costs associated with that facility that I'm not really seeing. And you've highlighted,
Yeah.
lease payments and things, but it just seemed like there might maybe something else there that should be.
Yeah, okay, thanks. That's good, helpful. Yeah, and Paul, on your, if there are specific examples like that, like the engineer or engineering staff, that would be great to hear all of that, like whether it's written up or not. Just as more specific we can get around what seems duplicative or what seems like could be contracted out rather than a staff member. It would be great. I think it's one of the benefits of where we are. It's like you all don't, as a prospective board, you don't have to, nor do you have the authority yet to make a decision on adopting a budget, but we can all be thinking about and should be thinking about what it's going to take so that when the time comes, this relates to the 2024 legislative session. We know what we're putting forward and you all feel good about it.
We don't have the authority to adopt a budget. But whatever budget's adopted, this authority, when we do become a real board, will have to live with. So I would hope that even though we are in an advisory capacity, that advice will be taken.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, there are formalities around when things become real, but that's the intent here. We know who the prospective board members are, and we know the path will be prospective board members become real authority board members there with real authority. So yeah, got it.
Colin?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo that I think we really need to see a bare bones budget from OSU. It's pretty clear we're not going to have enough money to pay for all of it, and we're probably not even going to have enough money to pay for the bare minimum. So I think it's really important for OSU to come to the table with a revised budget that shows, what's the minimum level of staff monitoring and research that needs to happen to stay compliant with the research platform and the HCP.
Any before I go to Bob, Tom, or anybody else you want to react to that, or any?
Well, yeah, we created a bare bones budget originally. We did the Pinto model. Does everybody remember what a Pinto is? The car that if you ran into the back end of it, it would explode. And then we had a Cadillac model, and we had something in between. And we can certainly redo that kind of a budget. That's how we kicked things off, was with a range of budgets based on there's no certainty around any of the modeling in terms of how much revenue is going to come to the forest. All models are wrong. Some are useful. And we put assumptions into models, and we put parameters and values into models, and we get an answer. And everybody thinks that answer is exactly what's going to happen, yet that's never what actually happens. It's some variation on it. Until we're on the ground, we won't really know what to expect in terms of productivity, in terms of net revenue, but we are going to predict it and do the best we can. We've gotten a lot of good input from Colin and Paul and Dan on making a more conservative estimate of our budget, and that's definitely, we have those budget estimates and can reestablish a expenditure budget that reflects that it's a balanced budget. In terms of now, are we achieving the objective of the legislation, which is to create a world-class research forest? If we create a bare bones budget based on restrictions on where we can do research and how we can generate revenue, then we're in a very different place than we were when we agreed on certain acreage in terms of where harvest could or couldn't take place and how. and assumptions around the productivity and logging costs and timber value. So that's a long way of saying, yes, we can come up with a bare bones budget. It will not, if we do so, we are not going to achieve that objective of a world-class research forest, because we'll be back to that model that is used in every other state, including here at Oregon State University, where you have a forester and staff working on the forest, but the researcher is absent at the university in a remote location. That model works, and we can certainly look at a variation that looks like that.
And Tom, is that the MacDunn model? Is that what you're talking about?
We have, nobody lives on the forest. There's no dormitories for researchers on the forest. There's no dormitories for students on the forest. But on the other hand, the MacDunn is connected to the city of Corvallis, so it's possible. The Elliott State Research Forest is a 4-hour drive from OSU. So the likelihood that you're going to have researchers driving back and forth on a daily basis are minimal at best. And there are costs associated with then lodging for people that are coming down and working for a couple of days at a time. And it doesn't meet that same purpose of infusing the community with the benefits of the having that research forest serve to employ people in the local community. One just minor, but not minor, one important thing that I said that I really need to clarify is that all of the timber harvest that's planned for the forest was planned as part of the research. It is research. None of the timber harvest that's being conducted is for the purpose of just generating revenue. The research design was created, as we all agreed, as that the research treatments are the way we also generate revenue, and that's part of the science or the research that goes into and comes out of the forest. And I think that's a really key part, because we're all wringing our hands over revenue projections, and yet the revenue generation is directly connected to the research. So just something to keep in mind as we're thinking through how we make this work. So the long and short of it is, yes, we can create a bare bones budget, and we can also pare down the research presence on the forest, but that will change the capacity and nature of the forest from what we have been talking about to something very different.
Thanks, Tom. Bob, then Paul, then Jennifer.
I was following Colin's comment, and then Tom has provided a lot more information. I guess what I'd say based on Tom's answers, I don't see it as an either or. What I see it as is it takes some time sometimes to get things ramped up, and hopefully we hit the ground running at full speed, but there's also a possibility that we won't. And so I certainly don't think of it in terms of a Pinto budget. I don't want the forest or OSU to explode, but I think of it as kind of a budget with kind of a need to have, how do we actually get the plane off the ground and fly it safely? And then what are the things we would add, and how do we add them, in terms of tiers of priority as we can do so? And again, hopefully we get to, full speed right away. But if we don't, I think we're gonna need an iterative path. And there's other mechanisms that as we get running, we can invoke. There's other grants and other sources of revenue. There's the climate dollars that may or may not be realistic down the road, and so on. And so I guess that's what I'm interested in is, kind of what's the bare minimum that we can just get moving, and then how do we add to that as possible and practical?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I think that's a really good point. And key to this that we haven't, of course, talked about is the startup cost, which was the describes those expenditures that would be needed to get things off and running. But then again, as we all agreed, this would be a self-sufficient forest. So I like what you're saying though about, let's start with that minimalistic budget and look at how we tier that up or how we ramp that up. But anyhow.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Tom, Paul, then Jennifer, and then I think we'll take a little break and then come back and talk specifically about ED and comms positions. So go ahead, Paul.
I guess when I say prioritize and bare bones, I'm thinking those things that are long-term, that we need to have some certainty that funding is going to be there for long-term, because forestry is long-term. The worst thing that we could do is go out and find alternative funding for a year or 2 years and then it not be there. And then the money that we spent on that research doesn't get completed. I've seen that on the Forest Service where they put in permanent plots to measure mortality after a fire. And 5 years later, they cut that money from the budget and nobody knows what the hell the mortality really was up there. So it's important to have certainty. And it's not that I don't want to give you $5 million. I'd love to give you $10 million. But I'm just saying the money isn't there. So what can we do to, as Bob said, and I've said, get this thing off the ground and get it started? What things can we say that we absolutely want to do and can do, and then prioritize those, and then we can add them. The money's all dedicated to research, and if we find more money down the road, that's where it's going to go.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think that's very well said. And there is the operational costs that, of course, that has to be baked in, because no matter what, you've got to keep the forest running and the roads maintained and all those pieces that go into just maintenance. And then there's the research costs on top of it. And we can, anyhow, definitely put together a range of budget options based on varied revenue projections. So please, Jennifer, go ahead.
So where I was going was kind of picking up on that. I spend a lot of my time on the Faculty Senate Budget Committee at Portland State, which is a lively place to spend some time. But just thinking about budget scenarios, right? So that we can, and trade-offs, right? So what you just said, Tom, which like if we can engage in scenarios where you can say there's this possibility, if given these assumptions, and here's a different possibility, maybe with some more generous assumptions. And then to Teresa's comment in the chat, I think it helps you pinpoint, gee whiz, we really would like to be able to do these things. In order to do those things, we're really going to need to find resources to do them, right? But it allows you to see both the trade-offs. If we choose to do this with this budget scenario, then we have to choose not to do something else. Or if we want to do both those things, then we need to figure out how to fill that gap and be able to both of them. So I just think like thinking in scenarios where you can see the spectrum of possibility and then hone in on to the priority question that I think Paul and Bob both mentioned. So.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer. Teresa, just you had mentioned something in the chat, and also we're joining a little after the beginning of the meeting. Did you want to jump in here and just highlight your comments there?
Hi. Sorry for sorry for the echoing and weird. I've got some bad internet connection right now. So I've been on the phone since almost the very beginning of the meeting, but
Gotcha.
I might use the chat more than speaking just because of weird connectivity issues.
We gotcha. Thanks. So if you didn't catch the chat, go ahead and take a look at that, but it relates to this conversation and a number of the topics you all have raised. We're kind of at the place of maybe folks needing a break. Is that sound good? And then we'll come back and talk about the specific positions on ED and communications. Brett, you just came off mute. You have something?
No, I was just preparing in case you needed me to say anything.
Why don't we take 15 minutes or till 1:45, and then we'll come back and get started again.
Sounds good.
Welcome back. Brett and Shannon, I'm going to turn to one or both of you to frame up the sort of the conversation related to ED and communications person roles and responsibility, if you'd be willing.
Sure. I think Brett has some slides, or maybe Jenna has them to pull up.
Yes.
But related to the conversation that we've been having on the budget, as well as the legislation, we wanted to take some time to have a further discussion about, in particular, the executive director and the communication needs for the Elliott as a research forest, and then the authority as a public agency altogether. And so on the draft Elliott State Research Forest budget, there is a research director position that is part of that research operations personnel. And the person and the expertise that are needed to run a research forest are tied into the vision for the roles and responsibilities related to the Elliott as a research forest. There are also roles and responsibilities for an executive director as the head of a public agency. And I think in these slides, we've pulled out the language that's in Senate Bill 1546 and really wanted to have a discussion about what are the roles and responsibilities, the skills and the needs of an executive director from the perspective of the Elliott State Research Forest Authority, and then also the need to have research director roles and responsibilities on the Elliott State Research Forest. And so it looks like Jenna has pulled up some example visuals of a couple of different ways that this could look. And these are just examples sort of trying to look at the relationship between the research operations of the forest, the needs of the public agency, the board authority, and by plotting this out, really have the conversation about how all of these pieces come together. So these are examples. And then we also have some questions, I think, to help get some discussion going around that. Brett, is there anything that you want to add?
Well, I think just to go through, Jen, if you could skip forward to the next slide, I believe it is. Yeah, just really quick. This is just a reminder of what the law says, and I'm not your attorney, but this is what the statute says around the board's role relevant to the executive director. And I mean, basically, I think the upshot is you all, as the prospective board transitions to the actual board of the authority, once the authority vests, you'll have the selection power, you'll have the oversight responsibility and authority, including, delegating. The statute calls out the board determining what roles and work to delegate to the ED versus, I assume keep for itself or some delegate elsewhere. And, your role clearly around the scope of the biennial operations plan, but giving input, direction, and guidance regarding operations and research to the ED. And then lastly, it's just clear in statute. And so I know it's from the budget conversation, it can get muddled around OSU's presenting a budget, DSL's presenting a budget. Those are just tools for the conversation around how we set up a pretty unique new state executive branch authority. But section 10 of the statute makes it pretty darn clear the ED reports to the board. So the next slide is a lot of things that are already in statute, in the law. Oh yeah, this is Jenna. I've got these, there are animations in this one, I think. So if you can just bring them all in, I think for the sake of time. There are a number of things, thank you, Jenna, that the law says about sorry, I should have changed the heading. These are the executive director's roles. And this is what the statute says the ED needs to be doing. And without going into a lot of detail, it kind of spans the covers the nature of what Shannon and I were talking to you all about related to, you know, this is an ED that will be the director of a new state administrative agency. And so duties related to engaging with the legislature and, you know, managing day-to-day operations of an executive branch enterprise, hiring and supervising staff and contractors. All those things are there, and there is the role around finding operation planning related to actual forest management and research, and collaborating with OSU around you know, adhering to the furtherance of the research forest missions and policies, yeah, I mean, public access and the role to restrict when needed. All of these things are listed out in statute, but I think the conversation that we want to have, and Jen, if you could go to the next slide, or I guess encourage you all to have, is around, you know, the statute lists out certain things around roles and responsibilities of the ED, but what do you all think? I mean, what do you all see as the primary roles and responsibilities that you want an ED to be doing and advancing work on behalf of you and the research forest mission? Because all that relates to, you know, how we, you know, what duties the board delegates to the ED versus not. In another related question, but I think a distinct thing is, what are the personal attributes and the skills and qualities that you all want and feel like an ED should have? And that's relevant to putting together a position description and, you know, the eventual process of going out and seeking ED candidates. So some discussion on that would be great. And related to it is, I think, just an overarching question that Shannon and I have around, given the nature of this unique animal of, you know, the Elliott State Research Forest Authority, can all of the things that are desired as personal attributes and skills and qualifications, as well as the duties, the roles and responsibilities, can all that be found in one person or vested into one person? Or do you have, do you all have thoughts on how to address the desired skills and duties and allocate them differently? The last question, and I know, Peter, it's probably best, I know it's good for everybody to see each other in a virtual meeting like this, but the last question is related to staff. And I think there are a number of staff positions listed in the budgets that Shannon and I reviewed, but the one that jumped out to us was around communications. And there's communication staff listed in both the budget Shannon showed and the one that I showed. Communications, you know, it's a word that entails a lot of different work in different realms, and depending on where you sit, it determines where you stand on communications in terms of what that means. But in this context, you know, there's a need for somebody to be engaging in communications in the context of the legislature and the policy realm, as well as with media and the research sector and networks of people in those realms, and then kind of local communities too. So we'd like to, if we have time, in addition to the ED questions, get into discussion, if you're willing to have it, or feedback around what your vision might be for the staff that support the ED and the authority relative to communications. So just
Thanks,
some prompts.
thanks, Brett. Good. Thanks, Brett. Let's go to Keith, then Paul, and Jenna. I think you can drop there you go. Then we can see each other. So go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, thank you, Brett, and I appreciate, and Jenna, and I appreciate the slides. I'll go backwards. I think a comm director is in a forest as we envision it will become a necessity of some sort. Somebody to reach out to media, reach out to the public. That's a fairly active job right there, and to reflect well on the board's intentions and the ED's intentions in that manner. I think that the skill set here is not. Got some people who just wandered in. The skill set here is certainly not impossible to find for the ED. It is, in my mind, I mean, we see this in GMs, you see this in city managers, you see this in a lot of different positions. I don't think that's impossible to find at all. I think the more difficult element will be finding people with that skill set who also have the know-how in forests. I mean, that might be make it a little bit more rare, but I have no concern that we'll find somebody who can excel in that role. I always want to caution here that as a board member, and as many of you are, that a board always has to be willing to give up the day-to-day operation of the thing they love here and that they're dedicated to, because that's not particularly our role, and or not as I see it. And that, I think, we need to be really clear of as well. I don't think we're going to have a problem filling this as a ED at all. But that role needs some real communication abilities to work closely with the board and sometimes with contentious boards as well. And I think a comm director of some sort will ultimately be very valuable to this whole process. And again, I think that the critical element for us, I think, as a board, is to be able to set policy, to be active, involved, to be to have our hands on the forest in many ways, but not on the day-to-day operation of the forest.
Thanks, Keith. Hey, and while you're off mute, can I push you just a little bit further? If you had to say for the ED position, what are the qualities or skills that you feel like would be most important in that position?
I think a vision of their own of how a forest of this magnitude should operate. B, the ability to work with the board, because ultimately they're going to have to put into play the board's vision, but to be able to carry their own vision into that discussion as well. And then the technical know-how of forests, and then also the ability to work with the staff underneath them, because they're going to be very dependent on their staff because it's 88,000 acres of forest or 90,000 acres of forest is pretty damn large, and a forest manager or an ED here is going to be largely dependent on their staff, and I think we can all see that. So for me, that would be it. Number one, I think they have to be able to have their own vision of how this should work. I think that's where their expertise comes in. Number two, and that'll be part of the selection process. Number two, they have to understand that they're an employee of the board, and that and there will be times when the board's vision long-term vision will come into play more than theirs, and they have the ability to work with staff closely and to carry out the wishes of the board. But I think that the ones that are successful in these positions, city managers, GMs, people that they have they have an ability to work closely with their board, even when they're not particularly in agreement, and because that'll happen. Is that what you're asking for?
It was. Thanks, Keith. Paul.
There we go. I guess I would, if you can see me, I would redraw the chart. We'll have a board of directors that is a volunteer, non-paid board that, as much as some of us would like to roll up our sleeves and be involved in a day-to-day, we can't, and we shouldn't. We need to provide a vision of what we as a group have decided this forest should be. So at the top, across the top of my flow chart, you have the board of directors of this new authority. That points down directly to our employee, who is the executive director, who although he may have his own vision, he needs to implement the vision of the board of directors. He needs to have the ability to manage a forest, and yeah, it's 80,000 acres, but it's contiguous and it isn't that big as far as land bases go. So that person needs to be able to act as an administrator, a contract administrator. OSU is below the ED, and they're a contractor. They're going to implement the research platform for this new authority. And the authority has the authority and the responsibility to manage the Elliott. University has the contract and the authority to implement the research. So they need to work together to implement that plan, but that ED needs to be the conduit to which we communicate with the university. So, you know, and as far as what attributes, they need to know how to manage land. They need to know how to implement, because this is going to be an active forest. They need to have that experience. We won't, as it's laid out right now, and I'm not sure if Jack, if you are actually a forester, but we don't have an actual forester on this board, an operations forester, what I call a dirt forester that can implement this plan. So I'm pretty confident that we need that expertise, someone who could implement the active management that this forest is going to need. So that's number one on my list. So beyond that, yeah, you need to have all the communication skills and the ability to work well, play well with others, but above and beyond all that, you need to have somebody that knows how to manage a forest and can cut through all to get technical, all the BS that's going to come at them from both directions, and get the job done.
Thanks, Paul. Bob? I'm going to leave you all to investigate the color commentary in the chat on your own. He or she. They. Go ahead, Bob.
I don't disagree with anything that's been said so far. I think they're going to need really solid sort of technical skills. I think without that, you're not going to be able to manage this forest, and that's sort of the foundation. But I would also emphasize sort of that a person who really can manage the community aspects of this, the board aspects of this, we've laid a very good, I think, solid sort of foundation and kind of bookends and boundaries, but there's a lot of work that goes on within that, and how that happens is going to be critically important, and how this person can synthesize things and put proposals forward and give options, and then coalesce people and run the gauntlet to make sure that they're bringing people along. This is a big experiment in collaboration, and so somebody that has those kinds of skills, and I think can both put forward. It's hard to find that person who can both put forward really solid visions of how to get things done, and also really take input to allow that to be shaped and modified as well. And you're going to need to be able to do both to move this group along, I think.
Thanks, Bob. It's helpful. Tom?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And yeah, those are all good points. I'm going to take a little different tact here, because I agree fully that the person who is going to be the executive director needs to understand management. They're in charge of the day-to-day management of the forest, but they are not the on-the-ground dirt forester. That person is actually identified as one of the employees that is managing the forest. OSU is contracted to manage the forest because the research is the management, Paul. We've been through this over and over again. That was from the outset, that the research is the management and the management is the research. The manager is an employee of OSU because the research cannot be decoupled from the management. And this notion that we can't manage a forest because we're a college, we do manage forests. We manage 10 forests, as a matter of fact, and universities all across the nation have research forests. And they are research forests. And the mission of this forest is as a research forest. And there, up until this point, there has not been a single researcher on the board until Jennifer has joined. And that has been one of the problems, because there's nobody advocating for science. And science is different than management. And yes, we need somebody, Paul, you can shake your head all you want. This person has to be able to do both. They have to be able to oversee the day-to-day operations, which is research and management. And the research is getting discounted. And you're saying OSU is down here, very, graphically, that because we opted to not take on ownership, which was never ownership, that we agreed that it was the best way forward was to keep the forest as a state entity, so that the governance of the forest was not to be held by a entity that is not, that although affiliated with the state, is not specifically a state agency. This created separation and from the tuition resources of the college or the university, which was important. But the point being that research forest is very, very different than a forest simply managed for timber. And if that person who's the executive director has no sense of research, or that isn't a key part of their expertise, the forest will never function as a world-class research entity.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to go Paul, then then Brett. And with an eye towards just to say it out loud, I think it's okay to emphasize that you have different emphasis in terms of the importance. That's why you have a diverse board and diverse representation. And our intent today is to offer the opportunity to get those qualities, the things you value, out on the table, not necessarily to create the hierarchy or name to do the whole structure today and get full alignment on it. But we wanted to at least have the opportunity for you to be able to articulate what are the quality, skills, and characteristics that are of value to you all individually, and then ultimately collectively as well. So that said, Paul and then Brett.
I specifically want to respond to Tom's statement that there wasn't a researcher involved in this process. For 4 years, we have been outnumbered probably 5-to-1 researchers because of OSU staff. So
I said on the board.
tell me that there haven't been researchers involved in this
I
process.
said on the board, Paul. I said on
We
the
don't
board.
haven't had a board.
I think
We don't
so.
have
Let
the-
me interject here. I don't know that this is so
My
I think-
frustration with OSU is coming out big time. And telling me that they haven't been involved in the decision-making process
I
is
didn't say that.
laughable.
I didn't say that, Paul. I said there had not been on the board up until this point, which was a committee. And that was my point, was just that there's no one within the advisory board or advisory committee that's been advocating for science. That was my point. I did not say not involved.
okay.
You don't need to be a scientist, a PhD to advocate for science, Tom. I find that offensive.
Well, I'm sorry, Paul, it's true, you have advocated for science. I guess my point is, for somebody that sees research as the focal point of a research forest, and that was not brought out in the comments that were just shared. I apologize, Paul, because you have advocated for science, and that was a misstatement on my side. I'm sorry.
Thanks for the candid exchange. Brett?
Yeah, it was along the lines of what you said, Peter. I think this is like all in the spirit of wanting a diverse board with diverse perspectives, and so many enterprises claim to want that, and feels like we have that here. Whether it's poke the bear and support of research, Paul, or operations, Paul. Like I've heard multiple things over time from everybody, new members on this entity, but I think that this all gets to the question that is around, can you find, if everybody is agreeing that what each of you are saying, not only is something you feel, but if others feel it has merit, somehow it's going to get to the question of, and can you find all these things in one person? I mean, can you find somebody who understands the research community and is a researcher? Can you find somebody who's an operations person and understands how to run a forest? There's also, like, working with tribal nations and communities, and like, you know, the whether it's the rural equity or the tribal equity end of things, those kinds of things. It's a lot. And I think that's part of our question is, can we, you know, when you're thinking about the position description, can you find it all in one person, or is there a need to think about how to structure the entity in a way that brings in different attributes from different people, if it's not the ED, then a lot of times entities will look to complementing the ED with other staff who provide skills that the ED may not have.
Thanks, Brett. Jennifer, thanks for raising your hand. I was going to call you, and if you would address also the comment you had mentioned in case folks didn't see it in the chat, and then we'll go to Jack.
Sure. So my comment was, you just distracted me, Peter. You threw me off on that one. I guess what I was thinking is that I think it would be, we should think about places like maybe it's at the retreat, or where collectively this group has a chance to really what's the word? Work through. And again, I sort of like to think of it like visualizing more of what like an what we would hope to see. Some examples of what a great outcome would be on the forest that demonstrates the integration of science and research on the forest in terms of a whole, I mean, there's a whole array of research topics, right? But I'm feeling like that's on us to come together in a way where we have a shared collective framework of thinking about this research forest that we can come back, we as a group come back to and remind ourselves of what that looks like and what the different types of research look like and what that means to have this be a research forest that is asking really important questions about the forests of the future and the integration and the interaction of people and forests in the future and all those things. Because I feel like, and people have already touched on this, an executive director hopefully comes with the skill sets to then be able to help actualize the aspirations that this group brings to realizing that world-class research forest. So in thinking about the skills, and I know the topic right now is the ED, but I feel like these conversations are about us. And we need to work through them in ways that then help create a framework, and that when there are trade-offs and when there are tensions and when there are tough decisions around research agendas or whatever it is, or if the forest is a system and you do something at one part of the forest, it affects other parts of the forest. And that's something we collectively, I think, need to engage with, think about, understand, and then create that space for an executive director to be able to help when we get to the nitty, when we're talking about more specific things, to have that sense of guidance from us, right, as a collective. So I know we're talking about the ED, but I feel like a lot of these are things that we need to come back to as a group in order to kind of build that framework. And the chat, what did I say in the chat? Oh, a collaborative systems thinker. Yeah, right.
Thanks, Jennifer. Jack.
Yeah, just, from my perspective, I think we can, kind of like Keith said originally as we started all this discussion, I think we can find a person that fits what we need in the ED. They obviously need to be a good administrator. They need to be a good collaborator. They need to be a promoter of research. But to me, I think maybe the biggest thing that an ED for the Elliott State Research Forest needs is that they need to not only buy into the concept of a world-class research forest, but they need to be able to be a champion of a world-class research forest. And we do have something very unique here, and I think that's a good selling point for prospective EDs. And so it just seems like that it's really important to find that person that not only has those administrative skill sets that we need, but also is very passionate about what we're trying to achieve here, because I think that's going to be very important, particularly early on in sort of the life of an ED for this group. So that's just my comment.
Thanks, Jack. And Teresa, I apologize. Jennifer, thanks for flagging it. Your hand hadn't popped up. I was going to check with you and Melissa. And Melissa, there you are too. So we're going to go Teresa, Keith, then Melissa. Teresa, are you in a position to?
Hey, sorry.
We got you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I just wanted to give an example, I think, of what seemed to me what I was thinking of this position of. So I work with the Wild Rivers Coast Forest Collaborative, which is made up of a board of stakeholders, and it's meant to inform management decisions. And of course, a little bit different scenario, but we have a coordinator whose background is in restoration project management. So his background is in the field of expertise, but works to basically carry out the desires of the board. So the board decides what projects they want to see, and this person works with partners and agencies to secure funding. So that includes writing grants and administering grants. And I think it's possible to find somebody who has those skills to administer contracts and work with partners and do the communication and admin stuff needed to organize the work of the board, but also has background in the natural resources field that we'll be working in. So just wanted to give that example of how I thought of this position.
Thanks, Teresa. Keith and then Melissa.
Yeah, Jack and Teresa touched on a little bit. Hey, Teresa, just for pick's sake, what the heck kind of plant is that?
It is a maidenhair fern, fiddlehead. So when it's first sprouting in the spring.
Very nice, thanks. Anyway, I think Jack and Teresa both touched on this in a couple of ways, but we're going to find the right one. But I'm not sure it's actually been said in this manner. In many ways, the ED is the face of the forest in terms of dealing with often when dealing with the legislature. The board will have some role there, but more practically on a day-to-day basis, the ED is the face of the forest. And I'm not sure if we said it in exactly that way, but I think Jack and Teresa both touched on that. That's it.
Thanks, Keith. Melissa, I thought I saw you pop up there for a second, but I don't want to miss out if you had additional observations or suggestions here.
I don't have anything to add. So thanks, Peter.
Okay.
It's all very well said.
Great. All right. Anything else on this topic? And then I want to go, if not on the ED specific piece, I want to circle back to the communications role. And Brett, you had described some of kind of the agency duties and responsibilities as it related to communication. And Shannon, I think when we've spoken in the past, you had some thoughts about sort of maybe more research oriented types of communication that the college had been contemplating. And I thought it might be helpful to shine a little light on that.
Sure. Did you want me to say something now or okay?
Right.
Sorry, I missed that first part. So I'm taking notes on what everyone is saying. So I forget who brought this up earlier. It may have been Keith about the importance of communications, both with the board, with local communities, with legislature, with and a big part of that also stems from, the structure of this authority as a public agency and the requirements under public meeting laws and under the legislation, as well as communications that are needed to interact with partners, with tribal nations, and with local communities. There's an interrelated piece about communicating the science that is coming out of the forest and the educational opportunities there. And so as we've been talking a little bit more about these roles, I think that's something that has also risen to the top, at least in my mind, and would really appreciate being able to hear some discussion about how members of this Prospective board are thinking about all these different areas of communication, both your needs as a board when you become an official board, and you'll have the support staff on the agency side, the needs for the agency as a public entity, and then the needs for the forest to be able to communicate clearly with partners, with the wide range of people who will be able to access education related to the forest about what those needs are, so that the science can be translated and available to everyone who wants to be a part of it.
Thanks, Shannon. Any reactions or thoughts related to that, or more broadly on the communications position?
I've been just adding on to it, I guess, if this prompts anything. I think it's like, it's possible that very little is known about the research unless somebody's actively working on making sure things are known about the research and what it's producing. And part of the proposition of this effort has been that research can be transformational around landscapes beyond and communities beyond just the Elliott. And that's making sure communications are happening around that if indeed the research is proving up to what everybody's hoping and what OSU's talked about. Yeah, it feels like care and feeding is needed there. Otherwise, you don't know if you don't hear something if there's no sound.
Thanks, Brett. All right. Seeing no takers on this, we'll the notes will reflect this conversation and those attributes. And then ultimately, as a couple of folks have said, this will start to feed into a draft position description, which we can talk about the timeline associated with that going forward. But this will be really helpful in starting to pull those pieces together. And obviously, you all will have an important hand in shaping that. With that, let's transition to the next agenda topic. So this is really around updates on work that's happening on the HCP, the research design, and the associated sort of complications, I suppose, related to financial viability. So there are some folks that have been really involved in sort of the nitty-gritty of this over the last month or so. There are others that are newer to these topics. There's new information to share with everybody today as well. So what the intent of this is this is a bit more of a level setting for everybody to get on the same page around some really important topics, and also to make sure we've got everybody who wants to be involved in the detailed work that's going to happen between now and the April 10 meeting, as well, and then ultimately the April 17 and 18 board meeting or board retreat. So this is a bit more of a like updating with opportunity for Q&A versus a full board discussion, although we certainly welcome discussion on it as well. That's having been said, Brett, I think you're up.
Yeah, and knowing this is there's a lot coming at you in the next little bit, and rather than putting documents up that I think are going to be potentially hard to read and see on the screen, and then Peter, with what you said around keeping it at a high level, I prepared a few slides, and I think Jenna, I'd like to just go through those, but with the intent overall on like bringing everybody up to speed, but also being clear. And Jenna, if you could go to the next slide, I think just being clear, like what this is that we're talking about around updates relevant to the HCP and financial viability and the research design viability. So I think where a lot of this started, it may kind of sit for a lot of people, is okay. There was an agreement made around the research design for the forest, and I think that was tied off in past efforts of the advisory committee and through the land board. And there were different levels of or different facets to the agreements made around that. And so I think what's coming at you is just an update around, we've got a lot that's happening in the HCP space, but this is not just an ESA murrelet buffer issue that we're talking about right here, right now. it does involve a shift in the timeline for the overall project workspace, not just in the HCP space, but overall relevant to all the other workspaces, including financial viability, the FMP, and decisions to be made by the land board and OSU's board of trustees. So I wanted to go through kind of at the outset the nature of what's going on here. How is this bubbling up, or why is it bubbled up? An approach to resolving it would be the next step, and some thoughts around that, as well as information to share. And then so there are some immediate next steps. And I think my takeaways on the next few slides, and just the nature of where we are. And I say that having stepped into this work relatively recently, and the we being not just like me in this job with DSL, but everybody who's attached to this Prospective board, and OSU and staff, as well as entities beyond who are tied to work here. This is a pretty important set of topics because of the significance of the implications. The work pieces, there's a lot of tugging and interrelated pieces here that stem from buffers, but also get at revisions related to financial viability and research viability. And it's complex because of a lot of the interrelationships. And there's a pretty darn heavy workload between now and the next time you all get together in April. But overall, it's not sky is falling in my mind anyway. So next slide, please, Jenna. Thanks. So I think this gets at where this started was around feedback on the draft EIS for the HCP that went in, and there are comments. There were comments made about, hey, we don't think there are buffers on the marble murrelet triads. Initially, when things started out, there was agreement around for folks on the advisory committee, agreement and commitments around moving forward with the Elliott research design. And, for people, I think like Bob and Teresa, there were some assumptions based on what they had heard around buffers exist around the murrelet trimas, and those buffers aren't there. And that came out pretty clearly through the process of running down response to public comments and in the conversations with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service around the HCP. But then, there've always been, I'm thinking of, you, Paul, and Colin, and others, there's always been an expectation that the research design would result in financial viability in a self-sustaining forest. And I mean, that's built into Senate Bill 1546. And so people came into this with different, a set of agreements around the research design and some expectations around it. And so where we are is not going back on any of those commitments, but we're in a problem-solving space where this gets back to the slide that's before you. If murrelet buffers were to be put on all of the occupied habitat, a lot of things, this is a slide that researchers can speak to better than me, but I think the emphasis here is the replicability of what research can produce across the triad allocations, and the replicability in the scientific integrity sense breaks down. If you were to, this is, the bottom slide shows the stochastic injection that happens when, if we were to talk about buffering all occupied murrelet habitat. The next slide gets at, thanks, Jenna, some rough numbers that we've run around. Okay, this is what could happen potentially depending on different scenarios of murrelet buffering being applied to different habitat types, whether it's modeled or occupied. And the implications, as you can see up here, are really pretty extensive and significant around shaking up the research design and the financial viability. That said, if you can go to the next one, Jenna, we're not talking about that, and we're not talking about those scenarios that you just saw on the screen, and there are ways to problem solve this that are challenging, but I think doable. I think to unpack kind of how we got here, the set of issues that has resulted in the need for a shift in the timeline away from July 1st and into what I'll get to in a little bit, November 1st, around certain deadlines, is it may have been daylighted by the Murelet buffer issue, but it's being driven by factors well beyond the HCP. And so, you know, the intent remains around getting an HCP and the related take permits, that it's essential for the ability of a forest to manage and actually operate on the forest, short of trying to do it all through take avoidance. The intent is still to minimize the controversy around the HCP and maximize durability, including the financial viability commitments, by doing this right and getting to a kind of a better product and outcome related to species protections and operations on the forest. And the intent remains to try to do that, get that HCP in a way that meets the research needs that OSU is advancing around what the viability of the design needs to be, and then also to make sure we're sticking to the financial viability commitments that are in the bill and that folks here have had. So all that being said, I think it's important to understand that the timeline shift is beyond just the HCP. Yes, the buffer issue creates some tension between the three significant areas of, you know, interrelated tugging in the Elliott space: the financial viability, the research design viability, and species protections. But, you know, the initial timeline was pretty aggressive. It was always tight and based on assumptions of what could be done by when, not just in the HCP space, but others that have turned out to be off or hard to manage too. The financial viability and research platform viability, or kind of operationality concerns, those aren't necessarily new. They've been there a while, and in some ways they're independent of the Murelet buffer issue. But the buffer issue makes them more poignant. And then there's just this fundamental desire for wanting to have the most durable product at the end of all this, and quality product at the end of all this, and the nature of the July 1 timeline forcing things into potentially sacrificing some of the values around trying to get there. So where we're going, or at least the approach to resolving this, it's multifold. And Jen, if you could go to the next slide. The first stop is to change the timeline. And given the way the Senate Bill 1546 was crafted, to do anything that's different than the current timeline, we have to go back to the legislature. And this is no small task, and there's help needed in working that forward. So Director Vicky, as director, and others have been pretty hard-nosed about, hey, the reality is the legislature gave us a timeline and a mandate in Senate Bill 1546, as did the Land Board, and that's what I've got. And you know, statements of I've got no ability to deviate from that direction. So where we are today is a shift, and it's, you know, required conversations with those in positions of authority in the legislature and state government that are beyond us. But we've gotten support for a bill, and the bill listed here is a Secretary of State bill, where there is the ability to shift the timeline through statute. A lot of the underlying vetting that needs to be done around, can we even get a bill, and are we going to have the support through the Land Board offices and the legislative leadership, has been done. And this does give us more time to address the concerns that exist, not just around Murelet buffers, but financial viability. And that's what we're proposing to do. So there's no bill draft out yet, but given where we are in the legislative session, things will start to move pretty quick. And a bill will pop out and a hearing will be scheduled and things will be moving. And I'll get to this at the end of the presentation, but we're going to need help. And I think the idea here is we've heard the concerns from multiple different corners around the current timeline. And we've listened. And, you know, Vicky, I don't know if you want to say anything further on this before I go on about the revised work plan commitments, but I think that's the upshot first to disclose is like, we're moving on a timeline change and a legislative mechanism to do that. It's not an easy space. It's going to need help, but it reflects having listened to what we've heard from not just you all, but others working on the project. And Vicky, I'll pause there if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and I saw Paul had a comment or question too. So let's go Vicky, then Paul, and maybe while we're talking, we'll drop the slides down.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks. And thanks, Brett, for sharing that. And sharing that we heard you. We've been hearing you for some time now. So we went to work to see what we could do to accommodate your concerns. As Brett said, Secretary of State had Senate Bill 161 as sort of a placeholder for what we needed and has now agreed to let us use that. The language has been drafted. It is down in Legislative Council for drafting the amendment. Very simple. In fact, the bill is a 2 paragraph bill. But it's very simple. That just gives us until November 1 to complete section 31. If you go to the regular Senate Bill 1546, you'll go down to section 31 and you'll see the operative date is now moved to November 1, as well as down in section 32, the State Land Board does not need to report to the legislature until February 15, 2024, instead of September 15, 2023. So it's very simple, but I have to say, even though we got ourselves a reprieve and we need to get this through the legislature, I believe the bill is being scheduled now for next week in Senator Golden's committee. But even though we got this small reprieve, it doesn't mean we have a whole lot of time. And Brett is going to go through the timeline of what we need to get done. And there isn't any more time after that, folks. We've got till November 1 if this bill passes, and that's it. So if you notice in Senate Bill 1546, which I dragged out of my work, it said in there, and it was on the screen earlier, something about the forest either managed by OSU or another entity. So if we can't get to an agreement and get this thing done, we got to go forward. Because if it's one thing I am not going back on, I am not going to put another damn HCP on my bookshelf in my office. Just not going to do it. There are several of them in the office right now. So I have to get an HCP done. I have to deliver it. And if we don't have a research forest as part of that HCP, I'm sorry, but I'm going forward to get an HCP. I want this to succeed, just like all of you. But as I said, I couldn't change the date because we had a bill, Senate Bill 1546. We're going to get that changed, hopefully. But the one thing I cannot change is getting an HCP. So I really am going to need your help to make sure we follow these new revised timelines. And the timelines aren't very lengthy, as Brett will show you. That's why I'm willing to invest in a retreat, because I think it's going to give you all a chance to say those words to one another that sometimes you hold back and sometimes you have on your mind that you haven't said. But we've got to get it done, folks. And I'm here to help you as best I can. And this is the first place where we can do that.
All right. So Brett, help me, you've got some more slides. You want to go through those, or maybe I'll quickly see if we can take, I don't know if they're quick, but Paul and then Colin and then your slides. Go ahead.
First, I'm confused. Vicky, what's this holding back that you're talking about?
Yeah, I noted that too.
Yeah. I think you answered my question. My concern is, I don't think November 1st is long enough. And that's my number one concern. Trying to get information to make decisions on finances is taking way longer than I had hoped. And I just don't know if November 1st is doable, but I think you answered the question, and that is the date, and we're going to go with it.
Brett, did you have
Paul,
something?
one thing on it, so this will deviate a little bit from the slides, and there's more that I want to daylight, but one consideration around the date, Paul, is given how the statute was set up, if we push the date out farther, we potentially get into a situation where, I mean, there's far meaning, the matter of a month or 30 days or whatever, and far meaning like into 2024. I think part of the consideration is the way the structure exists. You all as a board don't become a board until the authority is established, and the authority isn't established until those 6 things happen by the statutory trigger date. And what we didn't want to do was put a date out there that would make it impossible for the research forest to become a research forest and the authority to become an actual entity and a board to actually exist at a time that was beyond the start of the 2024 legislative session, because in order to be having a viable conversation around the budget or doing hiring, this entity, the authority entity, needs to be able to have a voice in the 2024 session. And if it doesn't exist, then you can't really, be a player in the session. So that's one consideration around the challenges of figuring out exactly what date to peg.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump the gun there on that one, Brett, but I think it's helpful. Colin, and then Brett will transition back to your slides.
Yeah, I also think November is unrealistic. We have a much bigger issue than the HCP itself, which is that the research platform, even without the mitigation imposed by the HCP, is not financially viable. We need to deal with that first. I think in the meantime, we need to completely hit pause on the HCP. And Vicky, you suggested that you're going to sign the HCP in November, whether it's part of a research forest managed by OSU or not, and you don't want to see another HCP wind up on your bookshelf. I think the current draft HCP we have, the bookshelf would be too high of a spot for it. It needs to go in the wastebasket, and we need to start over.
I appreciate those comments, Colin. I won't be signing an HCP on November 1. That's when we'll get the HCP to the agencies. Okay.
Okay, so
we got a lot of miles to cover here.
Yeah, and Jen, if you could take me back to the slides, that would be great. So if you could go back, thanks. Yeah, so the revised work plan and commitments around it. This is so I have a time. There's an adjusted timeline, and we can put something on the screen. Jen, I can send it to you really quick. But what I thought I would do instead is this speaks to revised work plan commitments and commitments from entities, including the federal services, on the timeline that it would take to get the HCP done, but also commitments from ICF related to the work around all of this, and the other work plan pieces, including OSU and DSL, where there are steps that lead up to Board of Trustees decisions and land board decisions related to financial viability and the HCP. I think if what I would prefer to do, and then walk me back into this timeline if you all want me to put it up, because I think it's a lot of words. It's going to be a lot of squinting. I can do it, but the gist of what the timeline is starting with November 1st as the statutory timeline. What we've got from there, that would not be when the final EIS is done and published in the Federal Register, which is the current statutory trigger. It's when the HCP would be turned over to the services, the federal services, for the final work through NEPA and their process for approving a habitat conservation plan and releasing or issuing the incidental take permits. It also puts dates out into the future related to that, where instead of, what under the current July timeline would have been a June a land board meeting and an April Board of Trustees meeting at Oregon State, those decisions and spaces shift likely out into October. I want to be clear, like the timeline that we've got and we're working with, this is something I know OSU is still considering and chewing on. But what we have from related to the HCP space is a commitment from the services and ICF that this timeline is doable on the HCP front. If you back up from the November 1 date, there are key dates to make you all aware of tied to this timeline, which I can put up, but I think for the sake of just key dates and information sharing, June would be the date when agreements are solidified around HCP revisions. The list of changes goes to the federal services. It's pens down on the extent of any changes to the HCP. Prior to that, in April would be when we would intend to tie off the conceptual agreements around what it's going to take to address the buffer concern. And again, this is a concern that's not just, it came up through public comment, but it's a concern that we're hearing directly from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And Colin, I know, and Tom and others, I know it raises a reaction of how could the Fish and Wildlife Service not permit this HCP given everything that's already on the table. But I want to daylight that this is not just a concern that's come up through comments from Bob and Teresa. It's a concern over edge effects that exists in the regulatory space of HCP issuance. And so we're taking it seriously and we need to problem solve around it. But there are also changes that we're proposing that we're going to need to work forward with conceptual agreements on come April, related to the harvest cap and related to the things I've listed here, revising data and kind of balancing out the financial viability implications. And so what I'll say at a high level, and this is a work in progress and work that we really need help doing, but under consideration are some approaches around problem solving all this, which is buffering to some extent. It's not the extent of everywhere on every occupied TRIMA. It's not getting into the numbers that you saw in the previous slide of, potentially 11,000 acres or more coming out of operational allocations, but to some extent buffering where it's strategically meaningful for murrelet protection and gaining credit that gets us to issuance of an HCP and take permits. Related to it is balancing out the impacts to the financial and research viability from any buffering, and that includes potential kind of creative conversations that are going to take some time, which the extended timeline is needed to do around maybe some rearrangements in the MRW or acres out of the CRW that could be moved into non-reserve operational allocations to ensure financial viability. The harvest cap approaches that we're talking about are related to using the harvest cap to demonstrate to the services that concerns around edge effects aren't a light switch. All of a sudden, harvest activity is going to result in huge numbers of or huge amounts of edge effects across the forest. The harvest cap existence provides some temporal minimization on what's going to be happening, how many acres over time, such that we feel like it can provide advantages in addressing edge effect concerns. But there's also a revision to the harvest cap to deal with some unintended consequences of that we want to address to ensure that the extensive treatments can occur consistent with the way they've been proposed, and that commercial thinning, not just regen harvest in the intensives, can also occur. Some of the cap language impedes that. And then another bit of the last bullet here is around revising data related to murrelet habitat designations. And that includes correcting some inaccuracies that I think will help on both sides of the coin related to financial viability and species protections. So that's a bit about what we're considering and what goes into the need for more time and what would need to be problem solved further. Jenna, if you could go to the next slide. I wanted to end on this one because there are immediate next steps where Senate Bill 161 is going to pop out at some point soon, and we're going to need help. And that relates to the question that we'll get into in discussion once I shut up is what do you all think, and are you willing as individual prospective board members to support the need for the increased timeline and help it through the legislature, because frankly we need the support if it's going to happen. And then secondly, around the board process, today I wanted to be sure to just that we were from DSL's end unpacking the timeline shift and what's proposed around it and some of what's being considered around problem solving, and just bring everybody on the board up to a level of information around all this. And the intent is to have more robust engagement with you all in April, and between now and then it's a lot of work. It's the intent is to have a subgroup of the board work on problem solving these issues and come back in April with pieces for you all to consider, knowing that it's going to be a really intense amount of work in the month ahead, and knowing that there are I think Bob, Teresa, Paul, and Colin are all
and Jennifer.
And Jennifer, on the financial, right, the financial viability subcommittee. There's a subset already of people who are engaged, interested, and wanting to, or I think ready to work on these things because they implicate things they're very interested in or concerned about. But I think we want to know if there are others, or if there's general board comfort in that subset of folks bringing something back in April, knowing that there's going to be some meaningful and intense work happening in the in-between time. So that's the that's the overview. And again, I can pull up the timeline if we want to look at the details, but I think some of what we're hoping to get
hold off
here
for
is
now,
just
Brett.
your reaction to all this, your flags on whether you feel like, okay, we're individually ready to support a timeline shift, and around the considerations for problem solving. I daylighted a bit of what is already being considered, but that even those 4 pieces need a lot of work, and there are going to be, you know, meetings between now and April to with OSU involved to address those things, as well as the larger issue that Colin raised. I mean, Colin, I know you want to see a pause in the HCP, and in some ways I feel like without, this is not a formal pause, but the timeline shift I think does create space to get at some of those financial viability concerns that I think you have characterized as they're beyond the buffer issue. Gives us space to chew on those and try to come up with a better pathway there too.
Thanks for the overview, Brett. Lots to cover. So let's start with reactions, questions related to timeline change and shifts. Then there's the open question of support for in the legislature, and then also the open question of who might, if anybody wants to volunteer to sort of do the deep dive on the financials and some of these issues as well. So let me start with Keith and then Bob, and then we'll go to others.
Thanks. Hey, Brett, you're back in Montana, I bet, huh? Looking at the snow out the window.
Are you seeing it? Yeah, it's not warm here.
Yeah, I got snowed on this morning heading up the river. So, hey, Jenna, could you back up a couple of slides, please, where we kind of started this one? One more right there. That's the one I want. Thanks. So, Brad, I've got one question, and then I just want to say thank you. First, I'm trying to get my arms around temporal minimization in terms of relation to the harvest cap, and maybe I'm too layman here. Can you walk me through that?
Yeah, I'll do my best. So part of the concern around the buffers from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service end is the edge effects, the effects of harvest happening adjacent to designated murrelet habitat, and then the impacts from that harvest flowing through the edges into murrelet habitat and impacting species. And part of the analysis that when the service sees, okay, over the term of the HCP or the proposed HCP, there would be X amount of harvest in intensive allocations and Y amount in extensive allocations. If they just ran the analysis based on that, it turns on a lot of lights all at once related to impacts from edge effects. But the reality is, under the harvest cap, there's a limit on the amount of intensive and extensive that would happen in a given year. And so we feel like, and again, this is all, Keith, this is technical, and it gets into I don't want to get too far over my skis about articulating something that is, I'm not a murrelet expert, and I'm not a technical staffer around the HCP. That's ICF's role, and then OSU has a lot of expertise around the edge effect issue. But I think the high level is we feel like we can use that harvest cap to our advantage in articulating that, hey, all the edge effects aren't going to all happen at once. And when you're assessing your perceived negative impacts from edge and level of take associated with it, that can be ratcheted back or addressed through the harvest cap. There's also, though, the need to, we feel, revise the harvest cap language to enable the research design and financials to advance as anticipated and not create disincentives that would be negative on the species end.
Okay, I like that at the end. Jenna, back again, if you would, please.
Sorry, I told her to drop it down.
Oh, no. Okay, yeah, and then Brett, number one.
Peter likes to look at you all, minding the herd.
Yeah, I just want, I want to say thanks for bringing up your second little arrow below the third bullet here about balancing out impacts to financial and research viability, and kind of insinuating that the whole MRW or CRW plan might well be, we might need to revisit that to some degree. And I think that's where you were going, and I've long been concerned about that. So thanks for bringing that up. It's a tough discussion. Now's not the place, but thank you. And if my schedule fits, certainly the funding subgroup is way more capable than me, but if it fits my schedule, I would not mind sitting through that.
Thanks, Keith. And Shannon, I suspect you're on this very topic. So maybe I'll go Shannon and then Bob and then Colin.
Thanks, Peter. I just wanted to add on and provide a clarification related to Keith's question about the harvest cap and the impacts of a marbled murrelet buffer and that zone. There's a limit on the amount of harvest associated with the research design that's dictated by the research design, in addition to the harvest cap. So it's not necessarily that the harvest cap discussion is tied to the analysis of what the impacts are for marbled murrelet buffer, because the research design does create limits. That one of the issues, I think, with the analysis and some of the prior work that had been done was the impact on marbled murrelet habitat or adjacent stands didn't account for the fact that the treatments don't happen everywhere all at once. So there's a temporal impact to that. And that's part of the discussions and going back and rerunning analyses and talking with Fish and Wildlife Service to sort of basically break that down and what the impacts look like across the landscape, but also over time with the habitat protections that are in place for the marbled murrelet habitat, and then the buffer discussion.
Thanks, Shannon. Bob.
Thanks. I support the extension. It's unfortunate, but I think it's clearly necessary. I think the key is to keep the pedal to the metal and not allow, months to go by and then get caught again at the tail end. We have a habit sometimes of doing that. I think as far as the buffers go, first and foremost, I see this as an exercise in, bringing the extensive forestry to the ground, the ecological forestry. Part of the goal of ecological forestry, part of the reason we do it, is to reduce fragmentation and create connectivity. And a good deal of the impacts on the landscape, half of them in the MRW, are extensive forestry related. So, I think there's a big opportunity to address a lot of the concerns that revolve around the buffers by actually starting to take a look at that. And I don't think that's that difficult of an exercise. I think you can look at where the marbled murrelet areas are, the trimas are, where the adjacency is in terms of extensive forestry and the opportunities that are inherent in that to create connectivity over time. And, I think there will still be some issues above and beyond that, but I think it's entirely consistent with the values that we wrote down, the bullet points. Why are we doing this? Well, to create more integrity in the forest, more resilient forests, more connectivity, less fragmentation, so on and so forth. Marbled murrelets are a great surrogate for all of those values that we're trying to achieve. And so to me, the challenge in part in the next couple of weeks really is to look at where those trimas are, look at those adjacencies, look at how the extensive can address creating more robust trimas consistent with the plan we have in place, and then see if there are, significant gaps left beyond that. But, I feel relatively confident. And I think part of that becomes an exercise in, where do you do 60% retention? Where do you do 80% retention? Where do you do 20% retention in those extensives? You know, and I know sometimes there's this concern, well, we need freedom to do research. Well, this is the research, right? The research is about how do you take this and make a more resilient landscape. So I think we're just kind of have to expedite some of that. I don't think it has to be perfect. I don't think it has to be exact. I don't even think we need new data necessarily to do a lot of it. But I think we can take a look at it, and it's a kind of mechanical exercise in some ways. So I hope that gives people a little bit of reassurance around that. And I could be wrong, you know, we could get in there and find out, holy crap, it's a nightmare, but I don't think so. I think this is actually starting to roll up our sleeves and apply all the theory we've created around this.
Thanks, Bob. Colin?
Yeah, so where I'm at is I am not ready to deal with this issue of the buffers until we deal with the overarching issue of the financials. And I have some comments that I wanted to deliver. Peter, would this be a good time for me to speak to those?
Sure.
Okay, so I apologize in advance. This is going to be a bit of a speech, but this is something that's been festering and simmering for a while now, and it's well past a boiling point. It's something that I'm really disappointed about, but I hope about what I'm about to say will be received constructively by OSU. A primary tenet of our mission was to develop a plan for the Elliott that would be financially self-sustaining, not relying on outside sources of income. Very early on, members of the advisory committee voiced concern that OSU was not sharing financial projections with the committee. In spite of these concerns, it wasn't until 3 years into the exercise, right before we entered into the 2022 executive short session, that OSU provided a financial analysis of the research platform. This financial analysis was presented to the public without any input or vetting from the tribes or others on the advisory committee with local, practical forest management experience. This failure to seek input from local experts was very evident. The model on which the analysis was built assumed annual growth of over 900 board feet per acre per year, a value that conflicted with commonly accepted benchmarks for yields on industrial managed forest lands in our region. Modeled yields in some stands exceeded 200,000 board feet per acre at final harvest. This is an absolutely absurd number, and it's a mistake that should have and would have been caught if the numbers were checked by a competent practicing forester with local experience. Over the past several years, the advisory committee, several members of the advisory committee with local forestry experience, as well as DSL's forester, have met with OSU. Our message to OSU has been clear. You cannot rely on these complicated and unrealistic computer simulations to predict growth and yields. You have to use actual, real-life, localized sources of information. That includes input from local foresters on what is reasonable. It includes looking at existing inventory data to determine what sort of volumes the forest is currently producing. It includes looking at past timber sale volume reports to determine what sort of per acre harvest numbers are achievable. It requires simple calculations, multiplying available acreage by average annual growth per acre to determine what is reasonable. OSU has not been responsive to this input. OSU faculty have discounted input from the tribes and local foresters as to what sort of growth and yields might be reasonable. Over a year has lapsed without OSU producing the simple yield and revenue calculation that multiple members of the advisory committee have requested. Instead, OSU continues to work with outside contractors on computer simulations of growth and yield that are not grounded in reality. The 2014 inventory data, ODF's pre-harvest cruises, and local input all suggest that current stands on the Elliott are producing somewhere in the range of 400 to 600 board feet per acre on a 60-year rotation. These existing stands were initiated under ODF management using intensive industrial style management techniques. ODF had a clear mandate to maximize production on the forest. They were tuned into the use of herbicides to control competing vegetation and maximize yields. They used clear-cut harvest prescriptions. They helicopter sprayed their units. They also used the Shutter Creek work crews to implement pre-harvest ground-based herbicide applications to control hardwoods. OSU is adamant that they can manage the Elliott in a way that will allow for the extraction of more wood volume on a sustainable basis. This is just not realistic. OSU does not have the same mandate as ODF did to maximize timber production. The use of herbicide is constrained by the research platform, the FMP, and the HCP, not to mention the realities of changing public perception. The Shutter Creek crew is no longer available to assist with labor-intensive ground-based herbicide applications. Additional constraints in the foundational documents and HCP are likely to further reduce yields below those that were realized under ODF management. Managing the Elliott to produce more volume than it is currently producing would require two things. First, it would require improving the stocking of commercial species, which in our case is primarily Douglas fir. Second, it would require improved control of non-commercial species so that all of the available resources are going towards harvestable growth. On the Elliott, some of the non-commercial species that compete with Douglas fir trees for resources are bigleaf maple, cherry, myrtle, hazel, huckleberry, and salmonberry. These are the culturally important plants to the tribes. Even if it were possible for OSU to double commercial production on the Elliott, doing so is not something that the tribes can support at the expense of eliminating these other culturally important species. In spite of all of this, and in spite of input from local people with real life, on the ground, practical knowledge, OSU is still maintaining that they will manage the Elliott to produce more volume outputs than previous local land managers were able to realize. We've been telling OSU that this is not realistic, but OSU is not listening. If the OSU is not able to listen to local people, including tribes, and is not able to recognize that local on-the-ground knowledge resulting from generations of living in this place is more valuable than computer simulations, then OSU has no business managing the Elliott. I'm hoping that we can change this current paradigm and that OSU can make an abrupt change in how they're approaching this project. My suggestions for making this happen are as follows. First, OSU needs to come to the realization that these computer modeling exercises have not been realistic or helpful. There will be a time for cutting-edge growth simulations in the future, but that time is not now. For now, OSU needs to be looking at existing experiences, inventory data, harvest data to determine what is realistic. The best current data indicates that the Elliott can produce around 400 to 600 board feet per acre per year, about half of what is indicated in OSU's financial analysis. Second, OSU needs to be transparent regarding past mistakes and our current situation. It's clear at this point that the research platform for the Elliott as currently designed will not come anywhere close to being financially self-sustaining. We can't work to remedy this issue until OSU is able to admit that there's a problem. Third, OSU needs to recognize that local knowledge, including indigenous knowledge, is often of much greater value than scientific knowledge. Sometimes the best sources of information are not published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It's often better to rely on real-life experiences of local people rather than relying on computer simulations. Fourth, we need to go back to the drawing board. Determine what level of per acre harvest is both sustainable and conservatively realistic on the Elliott, and then figure out how many acres would need to be managed in order to ensure that the Elliott is financially self-sustaining. If we can't do this, we've failed to deliver on one of our primary promises. And finally, OSU needs to initiate government-to-government consultation with affected tribes. The Coos, Lower Umpqua, Sayusla have been participating in this process as a stakeholder on the advisory committee. However, the tribes are not stakeholders. The Elliott is tribal land. It has been managed by the tribes since time immemorial. The tribes have special claims to those lands. They have a special interest in the future management of those lands, and they have specialized knowledge that is crucial to the success of research and management on those lands. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. Tom, do you have anything you wanted to say, or should I go to Paul? There's a lot to process
why don't
there.
you go to Paul?
Okay.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot there, and yeah, let's hear what Paul has to share first.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, or thanks, Tom. Go ahead, Paul.
Wow. I'm not trying to pile, well, I am trying to pile on. My frustration is probably been evident. I was frustrated the last time we got together, and I was trying to hold back, and I did hold back. There are things that I've asked for over a year. One of the things I got about 50 minutes before this meeting started, based on my quick review of that information from OSU, we've been talking about a forest that we thought was going to produce in a neighborhood of 17 million board feet a year. Their best case scenario out of the box is 9.6 million board feet. That's based on a measurement system that I don't think is proven. Actual go out with a reloscope and take plots and cruise it. It's more like about 8 million board feet a year. That's a big difference. This is why I don't think November 1st is realistic. I'm in favor of extending it. We need all the time that we can get. I still want to see this thing work, but I need to emphasize to everybody that this is a real problem. This was supposed to be self-sufficient, self-supporting. It was supposed to research active management and how we can do a better job, as Bob described, of managing to where we can actually create better habitat through management. The way it looks now, we won't be able to do any management. So I just want to stress how big of a problem this is.
Thanks, Paul. Tom?
Well, yeah, let me start with just saying that I absolutely appreciate the frustration and I appreciate the input. There's a lot of really valuable feedback that we were just given by the Becks. I mean, and Colin on multiple fronts. Yes, local knowledge is exceptionally important. Tribal and indigenous knowledge of historical management of that forest is exceptionally important and needs to be front and center. And yes, you're right, that the tribes are not stakeholders. They are they are sovereign nations that should be involved in the decision making on with regard to the research. That means the authority, not the OSU is a contractor, as you know, and but we would welcome having tribes engaged with OSU as a contractor, and as you know, we've been working on engaging with the affected tribes, and in terms of the tribes within the region that are explicitly interested in the Elliott and have historical owner, were the inhabitants of the land of the Elliott, and specifically the Seeking-Clusie. And with regard to the modeling values, we're attempting with that modeling effort to project out 100 years and provide some semblance of there's a lot of complexity in trying to project out to that length of time with this combination of research, plot allocations, and differences in harvesting. It's not just creating a harvest schedule for the next 10 years. Most forest plans, of course, are built around that perspective, even though the a forester is managing for 60 years out or 80 years out. And there have been some significant errors made in the modeling, and we acknowledge that. We had expected with the LiDAR flights that we would have an updated inventory ready to go, and we kept postponing engaging in a detailed remodeling using, because we wanted to use the updated inventory, not use an inventory from 2010. And the LiDAR flights were done. The data was not, the QA/QC on the data from the company is such that it has created numerous problems, and we're still working through those challenges. And that has been an enormous frustration to the people working on those analyses. With regard to just using the historic inventory and generating outputs, you're right, we relied on modeling, and we relied on an external consultant that was already under contract from with OSU from before the time I was here, and then we later engaged with other consultants, including local foresters, to ensure that the numbers that we're generating are meaningful. I really disagree with the notion that OSU has not been responsive. We've been trying to, working with the consulting firm and working with our local consultant, trying to generate the numbers that would be meaningful from a revenue projection perspective. We have not revised any cost estimates based on those revenue projections yet, because there's still a great deal of uncertainty. We did use a MAI that was significantly higher than what Dan Newton suggested or what you have. That was what was recommended to us through the consulting firm, was my understanding at least. But we also have numerous estimates of productivity from the region, from researchers and industrial producers, that gave us a broader range than what you're referring to. The long and short of it is, you're right, we have more work to do. We are still working on getting the most recent inventory operable and put into a form that we can use with confidence. And we have met with your, we've tried to provide a simplified analysis that as well, that and we've redone the model runs with the consulting firm, and provided outputs that do put those revenue projections significantly lower using those lower productivity values, but not taking into account potential changes in log prices and that type of thing. So we have more work to do. I can only say that there have been some shortcomings in the revenue projections. We have not revised the cost projections, and but we're in a good position to complete those analyses in the short term and revise the full operating budget accordingly. With that, I'm going to let Shannon or Katie follow up with anything that I missed, because I just sort of rambled through it.
Shannon, I see you there.
Yeah, and Katie, I don't know if you have anything to add, but first I would also like to acknowledge both Colin and Paul, your engagement on this, as you both mentioned, for over the past year, and raising areas where you have seen concern, where you have questions, and highlighting, as Tom said, some things that we needed to go back and look at from the modeling that was originally done. And since then, we have reached out to multiple people, including yourselves, to get additional values. We have, as Tom said, been working on an updated inventory, as well as some adjustments during the FMP time development process to, adjust treatments and try to bring all this together. And there have been further delays related to that in the inventory. So I acknowledge your frustration. I think we're all frustrated, but I understand that you both in particular are, because you've been trying to work through this with us for quite some time. And we are working with Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. We asked them to model exactly what you are telling us for yield values. And we just yesterday sent that information to you and other members of this prospective board who have expressed interest in being part of the financial subcommittee. But also understand that in addition to that, there have been requests for a simplified financial model. And so that was put together with the help of a local forestry consultant, as well as some operational and short-term harvest planning, which we are working on. And the goal is to dig into this together, to continue to dig into this together, to get out in the field together, to make sure that we're having productive conversations that are moving this forward, and understand where we need to balance on the other side of the budget. So I guess I'll just leave that there. And Colin, I see you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Shannon. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still hearing the responses that, we need more time. We're working on updated LiDAR inventory. We're working on updated models. Modeling is, I still feel like you're not hearing me, and you're not hearing the others who have chimed in on this. Modeling is not what you need. You need some basic arithmetic, using some basic assumptions. I hear that you're still working with Mason, Bruce, and Gerard on updated modeling. Mason, Bruce, and Gerard has done enough. I would describe what they've done as forestry malpractice. They royally messed up the initial appraisal, and they had a year to fix it, and they refused to admit that there was anything wrong with it. If I was in your position, I would say, thank you. Don't call us, we'll call you. You have two really experienced local foresters available to you. You have Eric Farm, and you have Dan Newton, who's still on contract with DSL and still available for you to use. I talked to Dan earlier this week. He said he hasn't heard from OSU in months. You need to be using simple analysis, not computer simulations. You need to be using local people with local experience, not Mason, Bruce, and Gerard. You need to be using existing data, not trying to continually get more new, better data. The information's out there. Tom, earlier in this meeting, you mentioned that you won't know if the models are accurate until you have boots on the ground. You already have boots on the ground. There are people here with experience on that forest. You're just not listening to them. As far as the simplified model that went out earlier this week, that simplified model, the format is great. It's a little bit more complex than I would have used even. It does, it does allow you to adjust some logging assumptions, which is great. The problem that I see with that is you have all these scenarios, but the scenarios are still way off the chart. The best case scenario that you had was still over 1,000 board feet per acre per year. And that's nowhere close to realistic. And the fact that you're still including scenarios like that and things that you're sending out to the board indicates that you think that that might be realistic. And that's not the case.
Okay, so let me, Paul, I see you. And then I'm also aware of the timeline and the fact that it's Friday afternoon, end of the week, after a long week, and everybody's probably at the ragged edge here. So I don't want to push the conversation beyond what we're all capable of doing at this hour of the day and the week. So Paul, something else?
I guess just to put it in a different way very quickly, you can only plan on harvesting what's there. Predicting is all great. It's a good exercise, but you can't plan on it. You cannot plan on it. You can only plan on what's on the forest now. And in the first 10 years, no matter what you predict going out, it doesn't matter. The first 10 years, that's what you got to plan on. That's why I wanted that short-term volumes and units that I got an hour before this meeting started. I've been asking for it for quite a while now. The last meeting I was promised it within a week. That was over a month ago. So that is what you need to focus and to pound down on who you need to be talking to. Dan Newton has managed the 3 largest landowners adjacent to the Elliott. He's managed that land. He knows what it'll produce. Best case scenario. You need to be utilizing that knowledge. That's what you need to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Paul, and we are fortunate to have people like Dan Newton who involved with this work, and he has provided us with that initial assessment to which we have been responding with revised analyses. And I'll just say that, I agree, Paul, in terms of having local knowledge and having that at the table and having that help guide this process is exceptionally important. But if we would have come forward with a projection of only looking out 10 years, we wouldn't have gotten anywhere with this. We had to project out 100 years. We had to say, this is what this looks like over the long term. And here's how this forest, because as you said earlier, everything was predicated on this notion of long term. If you aren't committed to the long term in terms of establishing your research plots and committing to them, so we modeled out as accordingly, and perhaps Colin's right. We have been misled by some of those analyses, but anyhow, I feel like we needed both. We need both the modeling and the long-term projection, as well as an analysis on short-term using practical, real world numbers. And I feel like that's where we are immediately headed. So I'll hold up there. I don't really have anything better or useful to share beyond that, except that we're working towards that goal.
So, Tom, I think it was a helpful response, and I think I appreciate folks raising it. These are difficult issues. Paul, I saw your thumbs up to what Tom suggested there. So I want to make sure that if there are other board members that have input, they would like to share at this point. These are complicated stuff, again, late in the day, but I want to make sure if there are other things related to this, folks want to weigh in on from the board members. I think Paul and Colin have had a fair amount of airspace here, but others want to weigh in. And then from a practical perspective, with an eye towards the clock and knowing that, again, we're late in the day on Friday. Oh, Brett, go ahead.
No, go for it. I can wait.
It feels like a more focused conversation on is precisely what you're saying there, Tom, on sort of modeling and local expertise and sort of near-term stuff and getting right-sized on what does that exactly look like. I think you all are actually probably more closely aligned than what it might appear right now. Like, I think there's a shared intent. The financials need to work for everybody. OSU has that commitment and needs that to work for the college and for the university. Everybody that's on this board and everybody who was a part of the advisory committee shared in that desire and that need. That's a fundamental premise of all of this. How we get there is important, and people's confidence in how we get that assurance is important as well. It's also not uncommon to have differing approaches to how you feel secure in an analysis, whether that's local knowledge, whether that's sort of modeling expertise. That's not unique to this group or this situation either. So I, as much as this is a difficult conversation, I also want to recognize that it's not entirely uncommon as you deal with really complex, difficult policy and natural resource decision-making processes. So hang in there. I happen to be looking at, in my other computer, a scheduling email from Tom, your assistant, and others. And I've been communicating over chat. I'm wondering if even as early as Monday afternoon, we might be able to continue the conversation. I'll let you mull on that, whether that's too quick or not. While Bob, we take your comment. And then before you start, for members of the public, I have just Lindsay, who's said she would like to make public comments. So we're planning on Lindsay, you're coming on here in the next few minutes for a 2-minute public comment. If anybody else needs to get in the queue, please let me know ASAP. Thanks. Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny, while Colin and Paul were talking, I was thinking you could kind of turn this into a Mad Lib and probably substitute some other terms like marble merlettes and things like that into, sort of some of the same themes. I mean, I think these themes have been somewhat pervasive in terms of, I feel like it's been hard to get information, feeling like we get back up against the wall, feeling like we haven't taken this to the ground in terms of details, so these aren't new themes. And, as I've said many times, I feel like some of this was deferred to the FMP, which is still in progress. I think the flip side of that is that, and so I share a lot of that. I think the flip side of that is, I think folks have been good about not throwing down the gauntlet and banging through these things, and we've gotten through them. And that's kind of how I'm approaching the Merlet. It's a big deal, but we've come a long way, and we're going to have to bang through it and figure it out. I think there's a commitment to achieving the ecological, financial, research, social goals of this thing, and the recognition that for one part of it to work, it all has to work. So, I guess that's how I'm approaching it at this point. We've got a little extra time. I'm glad we took it because we clearly weren't going to get there otherwise. But, we worked through all this stuff previously, and I think we'll work through it now. I think the key though, and I guess the message I would reinforce here is that we have a lot of these high level conversations about this and a lot of angst, but it is kind of roll up your sleeves time, take the information you have and turn it into a plan that people actually can believe in. And that's just we don't need to have a lot more meetings discussing the philosophy of it. We have to have a lot of meetings where we're marrying these concepts to the ground and actually looking at watersheds and seeing, what realistically can we get out of there? Is it accessible? Is there connectivity for merlets and so on and so forth? And I think if we spent more time doing that over the last 3 years and less time kind of talking about it, we'd be done. So, I mean, I think that's where I'm putting my energy for the next several weeks.
Thanks, Bob. You all have been hard at work for a very long time, and no folks maybe more than the OSU team especially. So I just encourage you all to hang in there. This is too important of an endeavor that too much effort has been put into to let it slip away at this point. So Brett, you need to talk timeline, and then we got to go to public comment.
Yeah, I think what Colin and Paul are raising is obviously significant, and that was probably, one of my take homes of this meeting is you're impressing upon everybody here how you're viewing the significance of the financials. It's that said, what Bob said about, I'm glad we have some more time. We don't. And if the current statute proceeds sunset, there's no Elliott State Forest and related authority if there's not an extension. So I would like to, I think I didn't hear anybody saying an extension of time would not be something they would support as part of Senate Bill 161. What I heard was more, we don't, from Colin, Paul, we don't think it's long enough. I think, to be prepared to say something in the state legislative session is going to be pretty important to the fate of that bill that comes forward. And so I guess what I'm wondering is whether outlining in a letter, hey, here are the reasons why we're all supportive of an extended timeline, including the financial viability concern and needs to address that. November 1st is in the bill. Could say, individually as prospective board members, we support that while recognizing some board members, or could even say there may be good reason to extend beyond that. But I worry, I guess, if there's no support for the legislation, what kind of message that sends while we're still, we're in this place of not wanting to take the foot off the gas on a lot of the steps that are ongoing, including related to the HCP, while at the same time being encouraged on this financial viability concern to take the foot off the gas and wait. And I'm hopeful that we can keep resolving things on multiple fronts at once, but that's the challenge of this project. And if we let the legislative timeline pass, I think July 1 clearly has not felt realistic to many people, but it is what it is at this point, unless we change it.
Keith?
Yeah, Brett, I'll gladly put my name to that letter, whatever, however you want to wordsmith it or whoever wordsmiths it. July 1 doesn't work, November 1 is better. And then if you want to add in potentially longer, I don't know how that works in terms of a bill, but my name will go on that letter.
Okay, thanks, Keith. And I'm happy to talk Colin, Paul, like offline about, and thanks, Jennifer, I see thumbs up, but about, your concerns around not long enough. And maybe that relates to something we can talk to on Monday. If we get that calendar through Tom, your calendar too.
Yeah,
Yeah, thanks, Jack.
Brett, could I just really briefly, I mean, the services weren't going to issue an HCP by July 1 anyhow. And so if we're planning on pushing ahead, we need to request an extension, and whether November is not long enough or not, I don't know. I simply accepted the November number or date because it was presented to me as what was viable. So, but I'm not set on November. I could be convinced to push back further as well. So, but anyhow, I definitely support an extension.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Paul?
Yeah, I support an extension. I've got 4 years, no small part of 4 years of my life invested in this thing. I believe in what we're trying to do. I have obviously stated strong concerns about what we're trying to do and whether it will work. But if November 1st is what we think we can get, then yes, let's go for that. And we'll see where we get.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter. I just wonder, I mean, there are bigger concerns that have been levied here. I just wanted to not lose sight of the fact that there's a legislative session going on and clock ticking on that front.
Thanks. And knowing even the frame of the very beginning of this agenda item was, hey, this is to get level set on an important and complicated set of issues for everybody. We've pushed beyond that somewhat. And with an eye towards timeline, I am hoping that we can continue the conversation about financial viability, sort of the appropriate balance. And I really do want to encourage everybody to think about this as there are many ways. Everybody's going to have to get to the level of comfort that's sufficient for them to feel like this is sustainable, and that there may be more than one tool that's necessary for folks to be able to get there, depending on how they're seeing, how they view the world, and how they find a sense of security from the information that they need to be able to sign on to something. And we have to be, it may take a multifaceted approach, and time is of the essence. So I know at least some folks are available Monday at 2 p.m. I know also that Jennifer, Paul, Colin, and then folks from DSL and OSU are interested in engaging in the financial conversations. Keith, you've indicated an interest if available. Bob, you've indicated an interest if available. Is there anybody else that would want to be sort of really into the weeds here between now and April conversations on that topic? Okay, so look for an email soon with details about a Monday afternoon conversation, and we'll keep going. This is, picking them up and putting them down, and we're going to keep after it. So all right, before we adjourn, Lindsay, you from American Bird Conservation, you had a public comment.
Yes, hi, thank you for taking my comment, and thank you to everyone who is in attendance today. You all have been putting in a lot of work here, and this meeting in particular has given me a lot to chew on as far as how I am viewing Merlet conservation within this larger plan. So I did just want to comment on buffers really quickly. It is concerning to me that the current lack of buffers does undermine the best available science that we currently have for murrelets. But what is more concerning is that I don't feel there's very much transparency in the text of the HCP, the DEIS, or the FMP about why that decision was made. I did provide some comments on buffers in the public comment period on the HCP and DEIS, but it was honestly really difficult to make well-informed comments with the level of detail that's currently in there. This meeting today, in particular, those slides that Brett provided gave a little bit of insight into the challenges posed by incorporation of buffers for murrelets. So I thank you for that. And Shannon also mentioned that there are some temporal limits, which I'm going to have to go back and look at because I cannot remember if that was made clear in the text or what sort of scale that was at. But it would be helpful to know, to have some clarity on what the link is there between what those limits would accomplish regarding murrelets. That did get me thinking that in addition to temporal limits, perhaps there could be a geographic rotation that wouldn't affect the overall study design, but would allow for functional buffers in the form of soft edges at like a rolling temporal and geographic scale. And I believe I made a comment similar to that in my comment letter, but something like that could be a strategy for buffering murrelet habitat without rendering that buffered area completely off limits. And that might ease some of the financial concerns that are being discussed, today. But the real substance of my comment is that whatever is decided needs to have clear documentation. I want to remind the group that when these documents are finalized, they will be used as precedent for future projects, future HCP requests, and it is really critical that the broader members of the public be able to understand what criteria were used for making these decisions. So that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie. All right. Anything else for the good of the order, or can I let you all go to a happy hour or a well-earned drink? At a minimum. Thanks, everybody. I know it's they're difficult conversations. Appreciate again everybody's perseverance, commitment, and willingness. Bob, as a reminder to your closing statements, that we've worked through. There's a long history of this group working together to resolve really complicated and contentious issues. This is an issue, a set of issues, and a landscape that has been fraught for many, many years, and nobody's cracked the code yet, and y'all are real close. So the fact that it gets difficult and is difficult is very understandable. And I, the frustration, please don't take it personally. It's not about you all as individuals. These are deeply held beliefs and values. So you're doing good work. Thanks for the efforts, and thanks for being here. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody.